What remains when a nation dismantles the grand homes it once built to display its greatest wealth? And why did America choose to erase the world of its Gilded Age? Welcome to Historic Docs Archive, dear listeners. Let me know where and when you are joining us. Settle in, feel at ease, and consider subscribing as we begin our story. The morning light over Manhattan in November of 1927 was thin and pale, the kind of light that seems to hesitate before touching the stone surfaces of the city. Along Fifth Avenue, where the air once shimmered with the delicate rhythms of carriage wheels and the confident footsteps of men and women dressed in the finest fabrics of their age, a different sound began to take hold. It was not loud at first. It was only a steady tapping, a measured strike against old marble, as if someone were knocking upon the past itself. Workers gathered near the towering walls of the Vanderbilt Mansion, a house that once stood as one of the largest private residences in the entire country, a symbol of the wealth and certainty of a world that believed its foundations could not be shaken. But on this morning, there was no certainty left, only the quiet impression that something immense had reached its natural end, and the city was preparing to let go of it. For decades, the mansion had dominated its corner of Fifth Avenue like a silent guardian of a lost kingdom. Its vast walls, intricate bronze doors, and sculpted figures seemed to look down upon the streets with cold confidence, reflecting the power of the family who built it. The structure had been designed not merely for living, but for declaring. It declared success, influence, permanence. It declared the triumph of industrial wealth, earned and accumulated during the great expansion of railroads and capital after the Civil War. For many who lived in the late 19th century, it seemed impossible to imagine that such a monument would ever be vulnerable. Yet that morning, the men who gathered with tools and helmets approached it without hesitation. They did not come with reverence. They came with purpose. Their task was simple, though heavy with meaning. The mansion was to be brought down, stone by stone, until nothing remained. The first strike of the hammer seemed small against the vast facade, but each hit sent out a faint vibration, as if awakening memories that had been asleep for years. The workers went about their duties with the calm focus of men accustomed to physical tasks, but around them, a few onlookers paused to watch from the sidewalks. Some were older, and their faces carried a quiet recognition. They remembered when the house was lit from within, when carriages lined the street, when guests arrived in formal gowns and polished shoes, and when the Vanderbilts themselves stepped through its doors, confident in the belief that their name would carry stability through generations. These onlookers did not speak. They simply observed, knowing instinctively that something more than a building was falling. The city, which had grown around this house, seemed to hold its breath. The first fragments of stone broke away, falling in a controlled manner, sending small clouds of dust into the cold air. The dust lifted slowly, carried by a faint breeze, revealing layers of the structure that had not seen daylight since the mansion was constructed. The sunlight reached into the cracks and openings like a thin, searching hand, touching wood panels, plaster, and the hidden bones of the building. In that moment, it became clear that time had done what no person could have imagined in the gilded decades of the late 19th century. Time had made the mansion fragile, not physically but socially. The world around it had changed so completely that it no longer fit. The rhythms of modern life, the expectations of a new economic order, and the rise of different forms of wealth and mobility had gradually stripped the house of its meaning. As the work continued, the noise grew slightly louder, though never violent or abrupt. It was a steady, repetitive breaking, a methodical unmaking of grandeur. Inside the mansion, rooms that once held heavy velvet curtains, elaborate chandeliers, imported carpets, and meticulously carved furniture were now empty and still. The echoes of former gatherings, the sounds of formal dinners, the distant music that once drifted through the halls, all existed only in memory. The workers moved from the outer walls to the deeper layers, revealing spaces that had once been alive with decoration and purposeful design. Hallways that had once carried the footsteps of servants and guests alike now stood open to the sky, exposed to cold air and daylight, stripped of their former intimacy. The transformation of the house from private symbol to public ruin unfolded with a quiet clarity. It was not dramatic. It was not sudden. It felt inevitable. The 19th century had built this house through ambition and economic opportunity. The 20th century, with its shifting priorities and new demands, was now gently closing the chapter. What once belonged to a specific family and a specific era was now becoming part of a larger story about change, impermanence, and the power of economic forces to reshape the physical landscape of a nation. Fifth Avenue, once lined with palaces, had already begun turning toward commerce, modern architecture, and the needs of a rapidly growing city. The Vanderbilt mansion was one of the final holdouts from a fading world. As the workers brought down more stone, the dust began to gather in small drifting clouds, softening the outlines of the surrounding buildings. It settled on windowsills, lampposts, and the coats of those who paused to watch the progress. It moved slowly through the cold air, creating a faint haze that made the morning feel suspended in time. People passing by, whether familiar with the history or not, sensed that they were witnessing a significant moment. Even if they did not know the details of the mansion's history or its role in the Gilded Age, they could see in the scale of the destruction that something large and meaningful was ending. Beyond the immediate scene, the city continued with its daily routines. Children were walking to school. Shops opened their doors. Streetcars clattered past. The modern world did not stop to mourn. Yet the sight of a great house falling into fragments brought a moment of reflection to those who happened to look. They realized, perhaps without fully articulating it, that enormous wealth, once expressed through structures like this, could not protect itself from the passage of time. The disappearance of the mansion symbolized the broader transformation of American society. A generation that had believed excess and permanence could be built with stone had been replaced by one that valued different forms of progress. The nation was moving toward efficiency, commerce, and the fluid mobility of the modern marketplace. As the morning advanced, a thin layer of dust coated the pavement, creating a faint path of gray footprints that stretched along the sidewalk. Cars drove by, leaving trails through the powder. The sounds of breaking stone continued, steady and constant, echoing softly between the buildings. The mansion, once a fortress of status, now seemed strangely vulnerable, almost delicate in its final hours. The walls, once strong and proud, appeared to release their weight reluctantly, as if acknowledging that their time had passed. By midday, portions of the structure had already disappeared, leaving open spaces where rooms had once been. Light entered these voids freely, illuminating the raw edges of the floors, the patterns of surviving tiles, and the empty frames where windows had stood. The building seemed to breathe, releasing its last traces of the world it once represented. Each falling stone felt like a faint memory returning to dust. The demolition would take time, but the symbolic moment had already occurred. The first stones had been struck. The first dust had risen. The process of erasure had begun. And in the drifting haze, suspended in the morning air, was the quiet reminder that eras do not end with announcements. They end slowly through the quiet removal of the spaces that once defined them. The Gilded Age, with all its brightness and shadows, was no longer standing here. The dust settling over broken stone was all that remained. The dust that drifted across the cold November air seemed to linger longer than the breeze could carry it, as though it resisted settling, unsure of where to fall in a city that no longer resembled the world that had built the great house, now disappearing behind the workers' steady rhythm. It hovered for moments at a time, forming pale veils that softened the outlines of lampposts and storefronts, and for a brief interval, it made the morning feel older than it truly was. People passing along the avenue stepped through the haze without pausing, yet the dust itself felt like a quiet message from another age. It carried with it the memory of polished marble floors, long dining tables lit by rows of candles, and staircases once considered grand enough to impress the most demanding guests. Each drifting particle seemed to hold the faintest echo of lives lived with a certainty that wealth could endure. And now, rising from broken stone, it moved gently through the air before slowly settling along the edges of the street. The dust hanging in the air became the doorway to a story much older than the demolition itself, a story rooted in ambition and expansion, a story that began on the nation's rails long before Fifth Avenue knew the weight of palaces. The Vanderbilts, whose name rested behind the mansion, now falling into fragments, had not started with marble walls or elaborate gardens. Their story began with movement, with the simple idea that an expanding country needed faster ways to cross its rivers, valleys, and growing frontiers. In the early years of the 19th century, a young man named Cornelius Vanderbilt found work transporting goods and passengers across New York Harbor. His boats were small at first, the work steady but unremarkable, the kind of labor that required long hours and constant attention. Yet from these modest beginnings emerged a vision shaped not by luxury, but by motion. Cornelius saw that America was changing, cities were growing, and the need for reliable transportation was becoming essential. The rivers and harbors were crowded with opportunities, and he took them one by one, building a small fleet, then a larger one, establishing himself not through inheritance or social favor, but through relentless effort. As steam replaced sail and the nation began to connect its regions through new technologies, Cornelius Vanderbilt shifted his attention to railroads. At first, the iron tracks seemed uncertain, expensive, and fragile, but he recognized the potential they carried. Railroads could collapse distances, unite markets, and allow goods and people to travel in ways that earlier generations could not imagine. By investing heavily, negotiating fiercely, and consolidating competing lines, he transformed the railroad industry into one of the central forces of American economic life. Freight moved faster. Cities grew in response to the new lines. Businesses expanded their reach. And through it all, the Vanderbilt name became tied not only to transportation, but to the very idea of national growth. The wealth that followed was vast, accumulating during decades of expansion, when regulation was minimal and ambition was rewarded with extraordinary profits. Cornelius Vanderbilt did not build palaces. His world was one of movement, of tracks and engines, of contracts and competition. The displays of wealth would come later, when his children and grandchildren inherited a fortune large enough to reshape entire neighborhoods. But the foundation of that fortune, the deeper origin of the mansion now dissolving into dust, lay in the railroads that had redrawn the American landscape. Each mile of track represented not just economic progress, but the rise of a new class of industrial leaders whose influence reached into politics, commerce, and culture. The dust over Fifth Avenue floated downward as if remembering those early years, when the nation was still finding its direction, and rail lines were being built through forests, across plains, and along riverbanks. The Vanderbilts became one of the most recognized families in this new world, a symbol of the country's ability to generate unprecedented wealth through industry. Their story reflected the larger story of the Gilded Age itself, when fortunes were made with a speed and scale that transformed ordinary citizens into individuals whose names carried national significance. As the family's influence grew, so did the scope of their ambitions. Cornelius's son, William Henry Vanderbilt, expanded the railroad empire further, bringing structure and stability to the operations his father had created. He managed the vast network with care, consolidating ownership and modernizing systems. Yet with each generation, the investors and builders who had once been absorbed in the work of growing an industry began to look outward. They began to imagine how wealth could be expressed not only through business, but through architecture, collections, philanthropy, and public presence. In the final decades of the 19th century, America was changing rapidly, and the wealthy looked to Europe for inspiration. Palaces, galleries, and estates became more than homes. They became statements of belonging to a broader cultural world. The Vanderbilt mansion that now crumbled into fragments had been built during this period, when the nation experienced a surge of confidence, believing that industry and enterprise had earned it a place alongside older European powers. Architects were commissioned to design homes that rivaled the great houses of Paris and London. Materials were imported. Artists and craftsmen were hired. And the result was a string of mansions up and down Fifth Avenue that seemed to claim the entire street as a private realm for the country's most prominent families. The dust on Fifth Avenue settled softly onto these memories, coloring the present with faint traces of the past. The workers demolishing the mansion likely knew little of the older world from which it had come. Their thoughts were focused on the day's tasks, the careful lowering of heavy stones, the steady clearing of debris, but the dust moved where it wished, drifting into the air as if gently reminding the city of how much had once depended upon the imagination of those who believed that their fortunes could create legacies that would last beyond their lifetimes. What the dust did not show was how difficult it had been to build the networks of influence and transportation that allowed such homes to rise. The early decades of railroad expansion were marked by competition, financial risk, and the constant challenge of technological limitations. Tracks needed to be laid carefully. Materials had to be imported or manufactured locally. Workers faced dangers daily, and yet the expansion continued, driven by men who saw railroads not as mere routes of travel, but as the arteries of a modernizing nation. Their success reflected a period in American history when infrastructure was both a business opportunity and a public necessity. The mansion falling into ruins were not built merely upon money. They were built upon the idea that wealth could anchor a family's story across generations. But as the dust continued its slow descent that November morning, it became clear that time had pulled the foundations out from beneath these structures long before the workers arrived. The city no longer looked to the railroad barons as symbols of its future. New forms of innovation were emerging. New expectations were shaping society, and the houses that once embodied triumph now appeared as relics from an earlier vision of success. The dust, still visible in the sunlight, began to drift lower, settling at last onto the pavement in a thin gray layer. It formed a quiet blanket over the sidewalk, gathering in the narrow lines between the stones. Even as it came to rest, it seemed to carry with it a trace of the past, a faint reminder of how the Vanderbilt dynasty had risen from the rails of a growing nation to build homes that once defined an era. The distant sound of train wheels, echoing faintly in memory, seemed to move through the air as if carried by the dust itself. The echo of steel on rails seemed to linger beneath the city's ordinary sounds, a distant reminder of the forces that had carried the Vanderbilts and so many others into the world history would later call the Gilded Age. It was not a loud echo, nor a sharp one, but a low, steady rhythm that felt as if it came from very far away, the way old memories sometimes surface, not as images but as faint impressions. That imagined sound, born from the memory of locomotives cutting through fields and mountains, formed a quiet line between the mansion's falling stones and the larger story of how America had reshaped itself after the Civil War. For the rails had done more than move trains. They had redrawn the map of the nation, connected cities, created new industries, and formed the foundation of fortunes that appeared to grow without limits. In the rhythm of steel meeting steel, one could trace the beginnings of a world built upon speed, expansion, and the belief that progress could be engineered through ambition alone. As the 19th century advanced, railroads became the defining symbol of American energy. Towns that had once been isolated by miles of countryside were suddenly pulled into the economic life of the nation. Small businesses found new customers. Farmers could send their crops farther, receiving better prices. Factories could move goods with greater efficiency. The country, long shaped by the slow pace of wagons and riverboats, began to accelerate. In this transformation, the men who controlled the rails grew in influence. They negotiated with governments. They became major employers. They shaped the cost of goods, the direction of trade, and the tempo of expansion. Among these figures, the Vanderbilt family stood prominently. Yet the story was not theirs alone. It belonged to a network of industrialists whose combined efforts and competitions built an entirely new landscape. The steel rails that stretched across the continent were mirrored by the steel frames rising within American cities. Factories expanded, filled with machines powered first by steam and then by electricity. Mines opened deeper into the earth. Oil fields grew. The wealth that gathered around these industries found its way into banks, investments, and eventually into the grand houses that appeared along avenues from New York to Chicago. The Gilded Age was not defined merely by luxury. It was defined by the belief that the country was entering a permanent age of abundance. The money generated by industry seemed not only vast but almost unstoppable, as if each new innovation unlocked a greater source of prosperity. Yet the echo of steel carried another story as well. For the rapid growth of railroads and industry created tensions that were felt far beyond the mansions of the wealthy. Laborers worked long hours under dangerous conditions. Wages often failed to match the rising cost of living. Towns that thrived when rail lines came through sometimes suffered when routes changed. The prosperity of one region could cause the decline of another. As the rails expanded, so did the inequalities woven into the fabric of American life. These disparities were not always visible from the windows of marble dining rooms or ballroom balconies, but they were present in the larger movement of the nation, shaping its future in ways that only became clear with time. Still, in the decades following the Civil War, the dominant feeling among industrialists and many in the upper classes was confidence. The country had survived its greatest internal conflict. It had preserved its unity. It had emerged with a strengthened sense of purpose. Reconstruction reshaped laws and institutions. Immigration brought millions of new workers. The economy surged forward, and with it came a cultural shift. Wealth was no longer something kept quietly behind modest doors. It became something to display, to affirm, to transform into monuments of stone and art. Families like the Vanderbilts embraced this new expression of status. Their homes became not only residences, but symbols of participation in what they believed was a new golden age of American society. In this atmosphere, architects and designers gained new prominence. They were tasked with creating spaces that reflected prosperity. Fifth Avenue began to fill with houses modeled after European palaces. Interiors were decorated with imported fabrics, carved ceilings, and paintings purchased from estates across the Atlantic. These decisions were not merely aesthetic. They were gestures toward a cultural identity that America was still shaping. The wealthy wanted to position themselves within a global tradition of elegance, refinement, and influence. The railroads had given them the means. Their homes became the outward signs of their success. But the echo of steel also hinted at the fragility of this world. For the same forces that had created the Gilded Age, growth, movement, innovation, could also shift direction. Markets could change. Technologies could evolve. Public attitudes could turn. And as the 20th century approached, the foundations beneath the great fortunes began to tremble. Railroads faced competition from automobiles and new forms of transportation. Labor unrest increased. Calls for regulation grew louder. Investigations into monopolies and corporate influence gained public support. The echo that had once symbolized progress began to sound differently. as though carrying a reminder that prosperity built on unrestrained expansion could not last in its original form. Still, as long as the trains ran and the industries thrived, the wealthy felt secure. The homes they built were designed to last for generations. Their investments reached into banking, shipping, insurance, steel, and oil. They supported charities, universities, and cultural institutions. They believed they were building not only personal legacies, but a national one. And for a time, it appeared that the world they created might endure indefinitely. Yet even in its strongest moments, the Gilded Age held within it the early signs of its decline. The workers who laid the tracks and operated the engines began to organize. Newspapers published stories about unsafe factories, political corruption, and unfair labor practices. The public grew more aware of the disparities between those who lived in mansions and those who struggled to pay rent in crowded tenements. As these perspectives spread, the once unquestioned admiration for industrial wealth began to shift toward scrutiny. The echo of steel on rails, still faintly imagined in the dust drifting over Fifth Avenue, captured both the rise and the tension of the era. It reflected the energy of a nation in motion and the strain of a society divided by its own success. It carried the memory of achievement and the weight of inequality. And as the echo faded, it pointed toward a future in which the world built upon the tracks of ambition would face challenges greater than its founders could have foreseen. The cooling steam in the evening air seemed to settle gently over this story, signaling a moment of transition, a soft pause before the next turn in the nation's path. The cooling steam in the evening air carried with it a sense of fading motion, as though the engines that had pulled America through its most ambitious decades were gradually losing strength, slowing after years of constant labor. That cooling steam, drifting upward in gentle waves from locomotives that had once raced across the country with unmatched force, mirrored the quiet shift taking place within the nation itself. For as the 19th century gave way to the 20th, the energy that had once fueled relentless expansion began to settle. The United States was still growing, still industrializing, still building its cities skyward, yet a subtle change had begun. The optimism that defined the earlier decades of the Gilded Age remained, but it now existed alongside a growing awareness of the costs that had accompanied such progress. Beneath the surface of prosperity, tensions were rising, shaped by the very systems that had once promised unending advancement. The cooling steam drifting into the night sky seemed to suggest that even the strongest forces must eventually pause. The railroad engines, symbols of power and movement, had always cooled after their long journeys, and in that temporary quiet, one could sense both accomplishment and vulnerability. The same was true for the great industrial fortunes. Families who had risen to extraordinary heights now found themselves navigating a changing nation, one in which wealth alone could not control every outcome. The railroad titans who had once dominated the economic landscape were observing new competitors, new technologies, and new social expectations. The certainty that wealth had once provided was slowly giving way to a more complicated reality. As the railroads spread across the country, connecting cities and regions with unprecedented speed, the industries built upon them expanded just as rapidly. Steel mills glowed through the night, producing the beams that supported the rising skylines of Chicago, Pittsburgh, and New York. Oil refineries processed the fuel that powered factories and lit American homes. Factories filled with machines and workers produced everything from textiles to machinery. Yet as these industries grew, so too did the pressures placed upon those who labored within them. Long hours, unsafe conditions, and uncertain wages shaped the daily lives of millions. The steam that cooled at the end of each day symbolized not only the slowing of machines, but the fatigue of workers who carried the physical burden of the nation's prosperity. The owners of these industries, many of whom built the mansions that line the avenues of the wealthy, recognized the scale of their success. They saw themselves as central figures in the progress of the nation. Their businesses created jobs, supplied materials, and supported the rapid development of infrastructure. They believed that their achievements justified the opulence in which they lived. The railroads, steel mills, and refineries were not mere enterprises. They were, to them, evidence of a new American identity, one built not on aristocratic heritage, but on innovation, competition, and the drive to transform opportunity into lasting legacy. Yet the cooling steam also hinted at a growing restlessness. Workers began to organize, forming unions that demanded fair treatment, safer conditions, and reasonable hours. Their voices, once scattered and faint, became clearer and more coordinated. Strikes occurred in factories, mines, and rail yards. In some cases, the conflicts escalated into violence, drawing public attention to the deeper divides forming within American society. The wealth produced by industrial expansion had not been evenly distributed. While grand homes rose along Fifth Avenue, crowded tenements appeared in neighborhoods only a few miles away. The contrast became increasingly difficult to ignore. The changing social landscape did not immediately shake the confidence of families like the Vanderbilts, Carnegies, and Rockefellers, but it created an atmosphere of uncertainty that had not existed in earlier decades. The nation was no longer defined solely by growth. It was now shaped by tensions between labor and management, between private wealth and public interest, between the dreams of industrial advancement and the realities of inequality. The cooling steam that rose from locomotives captured this moment perfectly. A brief pause, a moment to observe, a silent acknowledgement that even powerful engines must rest. Despite these tensions, the industrialists remained influential. Their wealth allowed them to fund new ventures, support cultural institutions, and shape public opinion through donations and philanthropic efforts. They built libraries, museums, and universities. They established foundations. They supported scientific research. These acts were presented as gestures of gratitude toward the nation that had allowed them to succeed. At the same time, they reinforced the social standing of the wealthy, positioning them as guardians of culture and progress. But the country was changing faster than many realized. New technologies emerged that threatened the dominance of the railroad. Automobiles began to appear on city streets, their engines humming with a new kind of independence. The idea of personal travel, free from set routes and timetables, captured the imagination of the public. Roads expanded, car companies grew, petroleum industries shifted their focus. The cooling steam from locomotives signaled more than the end of a journey. It marked the beginning of a transition that would eventually alter the balance of power within American transportation and industry. Still, during the early 20th century, the railroad remained a central force. Its presence shaped cities, economies, and the rhythms of daily life. The industrial magnates continued to rely on it as both a business and a symbol of their accomplishments. Yet beneath the surface, the foundations of their world were shifting. Regulation increased, public scrutiny intensified, economic cycles became more unpredictable. The certainty of wealth began to weaken in ways that were subtle at first, but undeniable over time. The cooling steam, floating gently through the air at dusk, settled lightly over train platforms, station rooftops, and rail yards that had once been filled with the energy of constant movement. The silence that followed brought a sense of reflection, as if the land itself were considering the changes unfolding within the nation. The Gilded Age had been built through bold expansion and boundless confidence. But the America entering the new century was far more complex, shaped by competing interests, emerging technologies, and the growing awareness that the systems sustaining the wealthy could not remain untouched forever. Families like the Vanderbilts continued to build, invest, and expand, still confident in their place at the center of American progress. Yet the world that had once seemed stable and assured was beginning to take on new forms. The steam that cooled at each day's end carried the faint suggestion that no system, no matter how powerful or prosperous, was immune to change. The engines would run again the next morning, just as the fortunes of the wealthy continued to move forward. But the pause, the quiet moment when the steam met the evening air, remained a reminder that the era's momentum, though strong, was not endless. As the twilight deepened, the last wisps of steam rose slowly, growing thinner as the air cooled further. They drifted upward, losing shape and clarity, dissolving gently into the night sky until nothing remained but the faint memory of motion. The faint glow of a chandelier fading in a distant ballroom seemed to echo this moment, bridging the world of industry with the world of society, linking the rails with the rooms that would soon define the height of Gilded Age ambition. The faint glow of that distant chandelier, suspended above polished floors and quiet halls, lingered in the imagination, like a small fragment of light carried from one world into another. It glimmered softly, as though unsure whether it still belonged to the evening it once illuminated. Yet that subtle glow held meaning, for it guided us from the world of industry back into the world of society, where families who ruled the Gilded Age gathered beneath ceilings painted with mythological scenes. The glow marked the transition from steel and steam to marble and silk, from the noise of labor to the quiet rituals of the wealthy, whose lives appeared insulated from the unrest spreading through the country. But that glow also revealed a truth often overlooked. The grandeur of those rooms depended entirely on the labor occurring far beyond their walls. And by the early 20th century, the people who maintained both the wealth and its display were no longer invisible. The chandelier's light, steady and warm, reflected in large mirrors arranged to make the rooms seem even larger. Serving staff moved quietly beneath it. They set tables, adjusted chairs, prepared for evenings that demanded precision. Drawing rooms filled with upholstered furniture awaited guests who would arrive on schedules, dictated by long-established customs. In these spaces, the wealthy gathered to reinforce the social order that defined their world. But beneath the elegance lay a sense of strain that was slowly intensifying. The rituals continued, yet each passing year introduced new uncertainties. The economy shifted, labor gained strength. Public opinion turned increasingly skeptical. Even within the mansions themselves, subtle changes revealed the pressures of a changing nation. The glow touched everything it fell upon. It softened portraits hung on the walls, portraits meant to immortalize families just a generation or two removed from more modest beginnings. The paintings depicted confidence, stability, and refinement, suggesting that the fortunes supporting these homes would endure indefinitely. But the world outside was becoming more complex. Newspapers reported on labor strikes and political campaigns, calling for reforms. Editorials questioned the fairness of extreme concentrations of wealth. Writers observed that the very families whose portraits projected permanence were subject to forces they could neither fully control nor ignore. The chandelier's light also fell upon the architectural details of these homes. Limestone facades, oak paneling, imported marble, and carefully carved ornament had been chosen not only for beauty, but to signify cultural legitimacy. The owners wished to be seen as something more than wealthy industrialists. They wished to appear refined, educated, and rooted in traditions as old as the European families they once admired. Yet beneath these carefully constructed surfaces, the tension between aspiration and reality occasionally showed itself. The families were undeniably powerful, but their status required constant reinforcement through display, hosting, and adherence to rules established by social leaders. In the largest and most respected households, those rules were shaped by the woman whose name defined the era's social hierarchy. Her influence had begun decades earlier, long before the chandelier cast its glow on this evening. Though she no longer walked the halls of her famous house, her presence remained woven into the rituals of society. Her standards dictated which families received invitations and which did not. Her preferences shaped everything from fashion to music, from seating arrangements at dinners to the placement of floral displays, and even after her passing, the echo of her authority endured. The wealthy continued to behave as though she were still watching from the shadows, assessing their choices with a silent but decisive gaze. Yet something had shifted. Younger generations raised within the polished world she had shaped no longer carried the same reverence for its traditions. They enjoyed the rituals, but did not fully understand why those rituals mattered. Some questioned the need for elaborate receptions. Others wondered whether the complex rules governing introductions, visits, and invitations still served any purpose. Their parents upheld these customs out of habit and pride, but their children sensed the world changing even if they could not yet define how. The faint glow of the chandelier revealed these generational differences in subtle ways. It illuminated a room where older guests discussed the past with certainty, confident that the social structure they had inherited would continue unchanged. Across the same room, younger guests stood near the windows, watching the city outside their homes grow louder and brighter. Automobiles passed on streets once dominated by carriages. Electric lights spread across neighborhoods, once dim after sunset. The sound of horns replaced the familiar rhythm of horses. The city was transforming, and the younger generation felt drawn toward that movement rather than toward the rituals unfolding behind them. The light also fell upon architectural drawings laid neatly on side tables, remnants of conversations about new construction. Some families considered expanding their homes. Others planned to build elsewhere. Yet these ambitions, once pursued confidently, were now accompanied by quieter discussions. The rising cost of labor made construction more expensive. Skilled artisans were harder to find. Maintaining a large staff no longer seemed as simple as it once had been. Even the wealthiest families hesitated before committing to projects that would have been routine a generation earlier. Beneath the chandelier's glow, one could sense a delicate balance between continuity and change. The houses still stood, the rituals continued, the wealth remained. But a certain stability had begun to erode. Families who had once believed their fortunes untouchable now recognized the need to adapt to a new era. They sensed that social expectations were shifting. They understood that politics no longer aligned perfectly with their interests. They noticed that their employees, who had once accepted difficult conditions without question, now sought alternatives. From the balcony overlooking the room, the chandelier appeared almost like a solitary star, suspended above a landscape undergoing transformation. It cast its warm light downward, but the reach of that light was limited. Beyond the walls of the mansion, the city continued its restless growth. Streets widened. Buildings rose taller, storefronts multiplied, a different rhythm took hold, one shaped not by elite rituals, but by the growing demands of commerce, industry, and working-class life. The glow that illuminated the interior could not compete with the broader transformation occurring outside. As the evening progressed, the chandelier dimmed slightly, its candles or bulbs reduced to a softer light. The guests continued to move through the rooms, unaware perhaps that they were living through a moment defined by transition. The wealth that once appeared solid now rested on a foundation altered by changing labor markets, shifting political priorities, and evolving social values. The families did not yet know it, but the era that had shaped their world was beginning to approach its final decades. The faint glow above the room eventually blended with the deeper darkness settling outside, becoming a single, indistinct source of light in the quiet night. That soft, unified glow marked the end of the evening and the beginning of another transformation still waiting beyond the horizon, one that would test the durability of the fortunes and the homes constructed during the Gilded Age. The glow remained steady for a moment longer, as if holding its place before the darkness finally surrounded it, guiding us gently toward the next chapter in this changing world. The soft darkness that gathered around the fading chandelier seemed to stretch outward, moving through the quiet hallways and emptying rooms until it reached the outer windows, where it met the glow of the sprawling city beyond. The merging of interior shadow and exterior light created a stillness that felt almost suspended in time, as though the mansion itself were pausing to listen to the world changing outside its walls. That darkness, calm and unbroken, signaled the close of another evening in a society that was beginning to sense, however gently, that the world it had built might not remain stable forever. It was within that slow, deep quiet that a new presence began to emerge, not a sound but a pressure, subtle and steady, that rose not from the drawing rooms or ballrooms, but from the streets, factories, and neighborhoods where the majority of Americans lived. The darkness inside these grand homes was peaceful, familiar, and almost comforting. The darkness outside, however, carried a different tone. It held the unspoken energy of a country experiencing profound change. The people who walked through the city streets at night, the factory workers, the clerks returning from long hours, the immigrants building new lives, moved beneath electric lights that extended far beyond the reach of any chandelier. They lived in a landscape shaped not by social rituals, but by economic necessity, industrial labor, and the demands of survival. Their world was growing larger, noisier, and more interconnected with each passing year, and their voices were slowly becoming louder. The wealthy had built their homes to stand apart from the rest of the city, believing that distance could preserve their stability. Yet the quiet pressure rising from the working and middle classes was no longer contained by distance. News traveled faster through newspapers, labor meetings, and political speeches. Cities grew denser, drawing people from rural areas into industrial centers. Every new arrival added to the complexity of American life, and every new community brought its own expectations for fairness, opportunity, and representation. This growing demand for inclusion cast a shadow over the long-held belief that wealth alone could guide the nation's progress. The darkness outside, illuminated by street lamps and electric signs, revealed crowds gathering not for social events, but for meetings, rallies, and demonstrations. Labor unions, once scattered and disorganized, had become powerful forces capable of influencing legislation and public opinion. Workers demanded safer conditions, shorter hours, and wages that reflected the rising cost of living. Their demands were grounded not in envy, but in necessity. The families living in mansions, though physically distant from these gatherings, could not remain untouched. Newspapers carried stories of strikes and protests directly to their breakfast tables. Business leaders attended meetings to discuss how to respond. Even the servants who worked inside the mansions heard the conversations, felt the tension, and sometimes shared the concerns of those protesting in the streets. The soft darkness within the grand homes now seemed increasingly fragile, as if the walls could no longer fully shield their owners from the realities unfolding beyond their doors. Families who had once believed that their wealth provided complete insulation began to notice the subtle ways in which the country was slipping beyond their control. Political candidates spoke openly about the need for regulation. Journalists published detailed investigations into the practices of powerful corporations. Books criticizing the excesses of the wealthy found eager audiences across the nation. The notion that wealth equaled wisdom or moral authority weakened steadily. Inside the mansions, older generations clung to the idea that society could be preserved through refinement and tradition. They continued to host dinners and social functions, believing that the rituals of the upper class still held meaning. But younger members of these families were increasingly aware that their world existed alongside a far larger, far more dynamic nation. Some of them embraced the changes, choosing to support new social causes, philanthropic efforts, or educational reforms. Others felt conflicted, unsure whether the traditions they had inherited could survive in a world moving so quickly toward modernity. A few resisted the change entirely, attempting to maintain distance even as the world pressed closer. The rising pressure was not always visible. It appeared sometimes in the form of gradual legislation, sometimes in sudden economic crises, and sometimes in the social shifts that happened quietly between generations. It could be felt in the changing language of newspapers, in the tone of political debates, and in the new expectations of a public that no longer accepted unquestioned authority. While the wealthy still commanded influence, the nature of that influence was beginning to change. They now needed to justify their roles, defend their interests, and adapt to a society that was becoming more democratic, more industrial, and more diverse. The darkness outside the mansions spread into neighborhoods where the rhythms of daily life were shaped by work rather than leisure. These neighborhoods were filled with people whose lives were connected to the same industries that had built the fortunes of the Gilded Age. Their labor kept factories running, trains moving, and businesses thriving. Their voices, once small and dispersed, gradually formed a collective weight that reshaped national priorities. They did not seek to destroy the wealthy, but to be included in a vision of prosperity that had long excluded them. Inside the mansions, the darkness softened the edges of furniture, artwork, and sculptures collected from around the world. It muted the shine of silver and gold. It drew long shadows across hallways and staircases. In that stillness, one could almost sense a pause, as though the houses themselves felt the shifting balance between the world they represented and the world growing beyond their reach. The darkness was gentle, but it hinted at the uncertainty that would soon define the coming decades. For now, the wealthy remained secure. Their homes stood strong, their influence continued, but the darkness, both inside and outside, carried a quiet message. It indicated that the era defined by unrestrained expansion, industrial confidence, and exclusive society was entering a new stage. The old assumptions would be tested, the old certainties would be questioned, and the pressure rising from the city streets, steady, persistent, and rooted in genuine need, would soon become impossible to ignore. The darkness deepened until it became a single, continuous shade, stretching from the quiet rooms of the mansions to the busy avenues outside. In that broad landscape of shadow, the first faint light of morning began to appear on the horizon, suggesting a new day whose challenges would illuminate the vulnerabilities that wealth had long attempted to conceal. The first faint light of morning that gathered on the distant horizon did not push the darkness away all at once. It rose gently, stretching through the thin spaces between buildings, climbing slowly along rooftops, and filtering into windows that had remained still throughout the night. That delicate light, almost hesitant in its arrival, revealed a nation waking into a new century, one that now carried the weight of its own contradictions. It illuminated the edges of mansions that still cast long shadows across the avenues, even as their significance began to fade, and it revealed, with equal clarity, the crowded neighborhoods and factory districts where the day's labor would soon begin again. This early light, soft but insistent, marked the beginning of a period in which the tensions that had once built quietly would now step out into the open. The glow touched the eastern walls of the wealthy homes first, warming the stone facades that had been designed to evoke permanence. For decades, these houses had stood as statements of confidence, expressing the belief that America's industrial fortunes rested upon foundations too solid to crack. Yet as the sunlight reached upward, it highlighted subtle changes that might have been invisible the night before. A hint of wear on a carved balustrade, a crack in a stone lintel, a shutter left unrepaired. They were small details, easily dismissed, but they symbolized something larger. The certainty that once wrapped these homes was beginning to loosen. Wealth still flowed, but not in the same patterns. Influence persisted, but with new limitations. The sunlight revealed not decline, but transition. At the same moment, the light reached the tenement districts, striking the upper floors of buildings, crowded with families who had come from distant countries in search of opportunity. The same industries that had built the mansions depended heavily on the labor of these communities. Their mornings began early, often before sunrise, as workers prepared for long days in factories, mills, or rail yards. Children stepped quietly around sleeping siblings. Mothers cooked simple meals. The light that spread into these rooms revealed lives shaped by hard work, limited resources, and the hope that tomorrow might offer something slightly better than today. These neighborhoods were full of resilience and increasingly full of voices that demanded fairness within the growing nation. The daylight reached the factories next. Their tall brick walls, once symbols of industrial pride, now stood at the center of debates about labor, wages, and safety. Machines inside were already warming to life as workers arrived, their footsteps echoing along the pavement. The light that streamed through high windows reflected off metal surfaces polished by years of use. Each machine represented progress, but also exhaustion. Each assembly line embodied efficiency, but also sacrifice. As the century progressed, the concerns that workers carried with them, concerns about working hours, pay, and security, became more structured, more organized, and more visible. The growing labor movement, which had begun quietly, now operated with confidence. It had leaders, demands, and a clear understanding of the power it held. The morning light that touched all these places revealed the growing interconnectedness of American society. The mansions, the tenements, and the factories were not isolated worlds. They were linked through the flow of labor, capital, and expectations. The wealthy relied on the workers who powered their industries. The workers relied on the jobs created by the wealthy. And the nation relied on both, hoping to maintain balance as pressures increased. For many years, this balance held, even as it strained under the weight of competing needs. But as sunlight filled the cities and towns each morning, it became clearer that the old order could not remain untouched. In boardrooms and private offices, business leaders studied reports that showed increasing demands for regulation. They read headlines describing strikes in distant states. They listened to advisors who warned that the political landscape was shifting. Campaigns for trust busting, for limits on monopolistic practices, and for protections for workers gained momentum. The morning papers delivered these concerns to breakfast tables across the country, and even families accustomed to stability began to recognize that change was no longer an abstract idea. It was present in every headline, every election debate, and every decision made in the halls of Congress. Yet the shifting political climate was only part of the story. Technological innovation continued to reshape the nation. Automobiles, once a rare sight, multiplied rapidly. Roads expanded across rural landscapes. The arrival of new consumer goods changed household routines. Motion pictures replaced parlor entertainments. Electricity transformed evenings. With each advancement, Americans from all classes redefined what it meant to live in a modern society. The values that had shaped the Gilded Age, display, permanence, and inherited influence, slowly gave way to values shaped by mobility, convenience, and mass culture. Still, the morning light reminded the wealthy of their enduring presence. Many families continued to hold significant influence. Their names appeared on university buildings, museums, and charitable foundations. They contributed to the arts. They funded medical research. They maintained their homes, hosted gatherings, and continued to believe in their ability to guide society. But the certainty that once accompanied their decisions had softened. They could no longer assume that their worldview would remain dominant, nor could they ignore the shifting priorities of a younger generation who questioned the necessity of old hierarchies. In the quieter moments before the city fully awakened, the morning light settled evenly across all these contrasting scenes. It fell on polished wood in luxurious parlors and on worn floorboards in crowded apartments. It reflected off gleaming metal in factories and glimmered on the glass storefronts of small shops opening for the day. It revealed a country full of movement and ambition, yet also full of conflict and inequality. And in that gentle illumination lay the beginning of a truth that would shape the decades to come. The recognition that the foundations of the Gilded Age were not unbreakable. The light continued to rise, brightening the skyline and turning the last traces of dawn into the clear morning of a new day. In that expanding brightness, the nation prepared to face challenges that would expose the weaknesses long hidden beneath its surface. A period of prosperity still lay ahead, but it would be a prosperity marked by instability. The light now revealed a world poised at the edge of transformation, quietly stepping toward events that would soon test the strength of its institutions, its economy, and the vast fortunes that had defined an era. The expanding brightness of the new day settled fully across the city, moving steadily from rooftops to streets, from quiet corners to crowded intersections, until even the smallest details stood clearly in the morning light. That brightness revealed a nation outwardly confident, yet inwardly carrying the first faint signs of imbalance. As Americans stepped into their routines, workers heading toward factories, merchants opening storefronts, families preparing for school and errands, there was an optimism in the air that reflected the country's continued growth. Yet beneath that optimism, the same light exposed the delicate cracks forming within the economic structure that had supported decades of expansion. These fractures were still invisible to most, but for those who watched closely, the brightness seemed almost too sharp, illuminating the vulnerabilities that had long existed in shadow. The country entered the early 20th century with remarkable energy. Businesses expanded rapidly, cities grew denser, new inventions appeared at a dizzying pace, telephones connected homes and offices, motion pictures captured audiences across the nation. Electricity became increasingly accessible, transforming night into something almost as active as day. The wealthy, whose fortunes had grown during the Gilded Age, embraced this progress. They invested in new industries, purchased automobiles, and built summer estates that reflected their growing confidence. They believed that the prosperity they enjoyed was evidence of a stable future. Yet the same morning brightness that reflected off the polished surfaces of their automobiles also revealed deeper truths. The growth of the nation depended upon a financial system that was becoming increasingly complex. Banks, trust companies, and investment firms handled enormous sums, often operating with limited regulation. Employers borrowed heavily to expand production. Consumers began purchasing goods on installment plans. Investors poured money into emerging industries. The system worked as long as confidence remained high, but confidence, like light, could shift quickly. For many families of the upper class, these concerns remained distant. They read reports in the financial pages, noted fluctuations in the stock market, and attended meetings with advisors, but they trusted that the nation's remarkable growth would smooth over any temporary instability. After all, they had witnessed volatility before, panics, downturns, and periods of uncertainty that eventually resolved into further expansion. They viewed the economy as a cycle, and cycles always moved upward again. Their belief in progress was strong, supported by the wealth they had already accumulated. Still, the morning brightness revealed more than optimism. It exposed uneven foundations across the country. Rural communities struggled with falling crop prices. Factory workers faced layoffs during slow seasons. Immigrant families navigated unstable employment and rising rents. As industries modernized, some jobs disappeared completely. These pressures built slowly, like thin cracks along a stone surface, widening only when stress increased. Most Americans continued with their daily lives, believing that the nation's overall prosperity would eventually reach them. But the light now revealed a truth that the wealthy often overlooked. The economic success of the nation was less secure than it appeared. As the brightness deepened into the full clarity of morning, attention turned increasingly toward the stock market. By the 1920s, the market had evolved into a central symbol of prosperity. Newspapers reported gains enthusiastically. Ordinary citizens began investing for the first time, encouraged by stories of quick success. Brokers extended credit, allowing investors to buy stocks with only a fraction of the price paid up front. The practice seemed harmless, even beneficial. It allowed more people to participate in the financial boom. But beneath the glow of rising prices, the risks quietly grew. The wealthy, too, became deeply involved in the market. They purchased large volumes of stock, invested in expanding industries, and sought opportunities in fields ranging from aviation to consumer goods. Some understood the dangers of speculation, but many trusted that the market's upward trajectory would continue. After all, they reasoned, America was modernizing rapidly. Its industries were strong. Its population was growing. Its resources were vast. The idea that the market could falter seemed as distant as the idea that their mansions might one day fall to dust. Yet not all observers were comfortable with the direction of the economy. Economists wrote cautiously about market saturation. Politicians debated new forms of regulation. Journalists published articles questioning whether prices reflected true value. But these voices were often overshadowed by the louder chorus of optimism that defined the decade. People preferred to believe in prosperity, not caution. The brightness of the era seemed to leave little room for worry. Meanwhile, the wealthy continued to host gatherings, travel abroad, and expand their estates. Their children attended elite schools and prepared to inherit the responsibilities of their families. Life in the upper class carried an air of certainty. The new century appeared to offer even more opportunities than the last. But as the sunlight revealed every surface with undeniable clarity, it became evident that the prosperity of the 1920s depended upon delicate balances that could shift suddenly if confidence wavered. In the working-class neighborhoods, the light revealed a different picture. Many families lived month to month, their stability dependent on steady wages and affordable housing. They purchased goods on credit, trusting that their incomes would continue. They saved what little they could. They watched the growing wealth of the nation with cautious hope, but also with a growing sense of uncertainty. While the wealthy felt secure, the working majority understood that their lives could be disrupted by even minor economic changes. The brightness of the morning made these contrasts even clearer. It revealed a country divided not only by wealth, but by vulnerability. Some lived atop the highest pillars of prosperity, confident in their ability to withstand change. Others lived with a constant awareness of risk. Yet all were connected through a financial system that grew more fragile as it expanded. As the morning advanced, the brightness intensified, reflecting off skyscrapers, storefront windows, and the surfaces of automobiles moving through busy streets. It created sharp edges, clear lines, and precise contrasts. It revealed everything in its path: strength, ambition, uncertainty, and the first faint signs of strain within the economic structure that had supported the Gilded Age and its heirs. In that full, unwavering light, the nation stood at the threshold of events that would soon reshape its future. The brightness continued to rise, climbing higher into the sky, marking the beginning of a day that would eventually give way to a long shadow, falling across the economy, the society, and the fortunes that had once seemed unshakable. The long shadow that would eventually stretch across the nation did not appear suddenly. It formed slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, as the bright, confident morning began its quiet descent toward afternoon. The sunlight that had earlier revealed the surface of prosperity now softened slightly, changing its angle and its tone. It no longer carried the same sharp clarity. Instead, it began to cast elongated silhouettes across streets, buildings, and fields, suggesting the beginning of something more uncertain. This afternoon light, still warm but gradually dimming, hinted that the brilliance of the era was moving past its peak. It marked a moment when the country continued to press forward, unaware that the foundations beneath its seemingly endless prosperity were shifting in ways that could no longer be ignored. The afternoon light fell across the nation's financial centers, where stock tickers clicked without rest, printing columns of numbers that seemed to rise with unstoppable energy. Brokers hurried across crowded trading floors, their gestures quick and confident. Investors, both wealthy and ordinary, studied charts and predictions. The market had become a living presence, a constant rhythm that influenced decisions across the nation. Every rise in stock prices confirmed the belief that America had reached a new level of productivity and innovation. Yet even as the afternoon sun shone through the tall windows of these financial buildings, it revealed the beginning of unease. Certain stocks behaved unpredictably, credit expanded too quickly, production in some industries outpaced demand. These signs were faint, like the earliest shadows cast by a declining sun, but they carried weight for those willing to look closely. In corporate offices, executives felt a subtle tension. Reports showed irregularities, warehouses filled with unsold goods, fluctuating prices, manufacturers adjusting their forecasts. Meetings grew longer. Analysts offered conflicting interpretations. Some urged caution, arguing that the pace of growth could not continue indefinitely. Others insisted that temporary fluctuations were normal in a modern economy. Most decision-makers, however, chose to remain optimistic. They had lived through years of expansion. Prosperity had become a habit, and it was difficult to imagine a future where it might slow. The afternoon light, warm and familiar, seemed to reinforce their confidence, but its lengthening shadows hinted at the deeper complications forming beneath the surface. Beyond the financial districts, the sunlight reached suburban neighborhoods where new houses had been built on freshly paved streets. Families who had recently joined the middle class enjoyed the stability these homes represented. They purchased radios, refrigerators, and automobiles, believing that their lives would continue improving. They saw themselves as part of a modern America, a nation defined by abundance and opportunity. Yet many of these purchases had been made on credit. Monthly payments accumulated quietly. As long as wages remained steady, there was no cause for alarm. But the afternoon light, steady and unhurried, seemed to shine more brightly on the truth that many lived closer to financial vulnerability than they realized. In rural areas, the changing light revealed even more concerning signs. Farmers faced declining crop prices, increased debt, and difficulty securing fair transportation costs. Tractors and new equipment, purchased during earlier years of optimism, became sources of financial strain as harvests earned less on the market. Families who had worked the land for generations found themselves negotiating with banks in distant cities. The railroads that once connected them to wider opportunity now carried their goods into markets oversaturated with supply. The gap between agricultural life and urban prosperity widened, and the afternoon sunlight made these divisions more visible. What had once appeared as temporary hardship now began to feel like a lasting imbalance. In industrial centers, factories that had run at full capacity during the height of the boom now slowed occasionally as demand fluctuated. Some workers were asked to take shorter shifts. Others were laid off for brief periods. The changes were small, easy to dismiss as ordinary adjustments within a modern economy. But the workers felt the difference. They noticed the reduced hours, the uncertainty in supervisors' voices, the rumors shared quietly on lunch breaks. Their wages, once sufficient, no longer stretched as far as before. Rent increased, food prices shifted, installment payments for household goods continued. The afternoon light, filtering through factory windows, cast long shadows across the machinery, as if emphasizing the distance between promise and reality. Meanwhile, the wealthy watched these developments from the vantage of their drawing rooms and private offices. They understood that markets rose and fell. They believed that industries corrected themselves. They trusted that the wisdom of business leaders, combined with America's natural resources and productivity, would prevent any real crisis. Yet even among the wealthy, there were signs of caution. Conversations at dinner parties included discussions about diversifying investments. Some families reduced travel, others postponed large construction projects. These decisions were made quietly, almost reluctantly, as though acknowledging instability might weaken the confidence required to maintain their standing. The afternoon sunlight drifting into their homes softened their surroundings, but also exposed subtle anxiety in their expressions. They had built their lives on predictability, and predictability no longer felt guaranteed. In cities across the nation, newspapers reported both triumphs and concerns. One page might celebrate rising profits, new inventions, and expanding industries. Another might describe declining crop prices, labor disputes, or speculative excess in the stock market. Readers absorbed these stories with mixed emotions, unsure of which future awaited them. They trusted their leaders. They trusted progress. And yet the afternoon light, calm and unhurried, revealed that the nation's optimism now rested on uneven ground. As the sun continued its slow descent, the shadows grew longer, crossing streets, fields, and the walls of both modest homes and grand estates. These shadows did not yet signal collapse, but they marked a transition, a shift from unquestioned confidence to quiet apprehension. The light still illuminated the country clearly, but what it revealed was no longer as simple. It showed growth, innovation, and modernity, but it also revealed debt, imbalance, and dependence on a financial system more fragile than most understood. The afternoon moved steadily toward evening, and the glow that had once filled the sky began to deepen in color, softening into gold. In that warm light, the nation continued its daily rhythms, unaware that this balance, this delicate interplay of prosperity and vulnerability, would soon be tested by events capable of reshaping everything from household budgets to the fate of the grandest mansions built during the Gilded Age. As the sun neared the horizon, its fading light stretched out across the land one final time, leaving behind long shadows that touched every level of society, quietly signaling that the world was approaching a moment that would require more than confidence to endure. The long shadows that stretched across the land, reaching from quiet suburban streets to the tallest towers of financial districts, deepened steadily as the sun lowered itself toward the horizon. What had begun as a gentle afternoon calm slowly settled into an atmosphere weighted with uncertainty, though few yet recognized it for what it was. The shadows lengthened not only across pavement and fields, but across the collective imagination of a nation that still believed itself insulated by its own success. In that gathering dimness, the first cool layers of evening touched rooftops and tree lines, and the light that remained softened into a muted glow. That glow, fragile and fleeting, marked the arrival of a moment when the country continued to move confidently forward, unaware that the last stability of the age was slipping quietly from beneath its feet. The evening light, neither bright nor dark, revealed a world standing unknowingly at the edge of a precipice. As dusk descended, the financial districts remained alive with activity. Lights flickered on inside tall office buildings, illuminating rows of desks and stacks of documents where clerks continued to record transactions that few fully understood. Telephones rang with urgency. Brokers reviewed orders that had arrived too late in the day to process. Some prepared for tomorrow's trading. Others lingered, troubled by subtle irregularities they could not yet explain. Outside, the glow of street lamps cast wide circles of light on the sidewalks, where late-working employees exited through heavy doors and stepped into the cool air. They spoke quietly about market fluctuations, about rumors that circulated through brokerage houses, and about signs of strain appearing in certain sectors of the economy. But these conversations dissolved quickly into the ordinary rhythms of evening, for no one could yet imagine the crisis that lay ahead. In the wealthy neighborhoods, the evening glow reflected softly against the wide windows of mansions that stood with the same regal stillness they had displayed for decades. Dinner tables were set with silver polished earlier in the day. Music drifted from phonographs placed in drawing rooms. Servants moved quietly through the hallways, preparing for guests who would arrive in carriages or automobiles. In these homes, discussions centered on social events, travel plans, and philanthropic commitments. Yet even here, the shadows of the evening carried a subtle sense of unease. Some families had noticed the recent nervousness on Wall Street. Others observed that profits from their businesses had begun to shift unpredictably. But these concerns remained topics for brief, private conversation and rarely entered the public spaces of their homes. The glow of chandeliers and the warmth of candlelight created the illusion that the world beyond their walls remained unchanged. Meanwhile, in modest apartments and tenement buildings, the evening glow came from single lamps placed near kitchen tables. Families gathered for simple meals, discussing the day's work and the uncertainty that seemed to grow quietly around them. Factory workers returned home, tired from long hours standing at machines whose wages did not always match the rising costs of urban life. Laborers who had recently experienced temporary layoffs wondered whether their employers would call them back. Young couples carrying small debts from household purchases prepared their budgets for the coming week, knowing that even minor changes in wages or prices could disrupt their fragile stability. The glow inside these homes illuminated not luxury, but resilience. In rural communities, the sunset brought a different kind of quiet. Fields stretched into the distance beneath the dimming sky, and farmhouses stood silhouetted against the fading light. Farmers gathered on porches or around kitchen tables, discussing crop prices and the latest news delivered by radio broadcasts. The decline in agricultural markets had already placed many families under significant strain, yet they held on to hope, believing that the nation's prosperity would eventually reach them. The glow of oil lamps cast soft circles of light on worn wooden floors, revealing faces lined with exhaustion, but also with perseverance. The rural world felt distant from the financial concerns of the cities, yet it was deeply tied to them through banks, railroads, and markets that determined the value of their work. As the sky darkened further, the lights from the growing number of automobiles created thin streams of brightness that wound through city streets and country roads alike. Automobiles had changed the landscape not only physically, but emotionally. They symbolized progress, independence, and the belief that the future would continue to offer new conveniences. Families saved carefully for these vehicles, trusting that mobility could lead to opportunity. Yet the same automobiles that represented modern comfort also reflected the growing complexity of American economic life. Many had been purchased on installment plans, binding owners to future payments that relied on stable incomes. The glow of headlights cutting through the night revealed a nation eager to embrace modernity, even as it stood precariously on an economic foundation more fragile than it appeared. In factories, the evening shifts continued under electric lights that illuminated rows of machines, now running more slowly as demand wavered. The glow from these overhead lamps reflected off metal parts and conveyor belts, creating long lines of light that stretched across factory floors. Supervisors monitored production with increasing caution. Workers sensed changes in tone, in instructions, and in atmosphere. Some were told that orders had decreased. Others noticed that maintenance had been postponed. Still others observed that managers held more closed-door meetings than usual. The glow inside these industrial buildings contrasted sharply with the fading light outside, creating two different versions of a world on the brink. In cities, the evening deepened into night. Theaters filled with audiences seeking escape through films and performances. Restaurants welcomed patrons who spoke of politics, art, and everyday concerns. Streets buzzed with movement and conversation. And yet, through it all, the long shadow that had begun forming earlier in the day persisted. It did not disrupt daily life, nor did it cast a sense of immediate danger. Instead, it lingered quietly, settling into the spaces where certainty had once been absolute. It stretched across financial decisions, household budgets, and the expectations of both the wealthy and the working class. It reminded those who noticed it that the brilliance of the era had begun to settle, replaced gradually by a twilight that hinted at more profound challenges ahead. By the time the last traces of daylight disappeared from the sky, the entire nation was wrapped in the soft, unassuming glow of electric lights, lanterns, and lamps. These artificial illuminations gave the impression of control, of stability maintained by human effort rather than natural rhythms. But beneath that glow, the country stood unknowingly at the threshold of a moment that would soon plunge it into the deepest economic darkness it had ever faced. A moment when the long shadow stretching across the land would reveal its full meaning. And as night settled fully, one final flicker of light remained in the distance, faint yet unmistakable, signaling the arrival of events that would forever alter the course of American life. The final flicker of distant light, small and trembling against the vast darkness of the night sky, lingered for a moment as though unsure whether to fade or to signal a warning. It hovered above the skyline like a fragile ember at the edge of a fire that had burned brightly for decades, illuminating an age of ambition, confidence, and immense transformation. Yet now, as that faint light struggled to hold its place, it became the last visible trace of an era entering a profound and irreversible shift. Across the country, most Americans went to sleep unaware that this fragile glow marked the beginning of a process that would soon overwhelm banks, businesses, and households alike. But for a few who watched the markets closely or who sensed the slow tightening of financial conditions, that small flicker seemed to contain all the unease that had been building quietly beneath the surface. It was a reminder that the system sustaining the nation had limits, and those limits were about to be tested in ways no one could fully anticipate. During the early hours of the night, financial buildings that had remained active into the evening finally emptied. The last lights were extinguished in brokerage houses where clerks had worked late to reconcile transactions that no longer aligned with the expectations of the booming decade. In these darkened rooms, the silence felt heavy. The tickers had stopped for the night, but their printed numbers lay scattered across desks, carrying hints of instability that had not been present even a year earlier. A few analysts, troubled by unusual patterns, had stayed later than usual, reviewing reports under the dim glow of desk lamps. They had found inconsistencies, overextended credit, inflated valuations, and a growing number of investors behind on their payments. But the full implications of these findings had not yet been grasped. For the moment, the darkness provided temporary relief from the relentless motion of the market. Far away from Wall Street, in the quiet suburbs where middle-class families slept in modest homes, the night carried a different kind of stillness. The glow of streetlights cast small pools of illumination along sidewalks and driveways, reflecting the stability these families believed they had achieved. Inside, radios sat silent on tables, their dials waiting to bring the latest news in the morning. Newly purchased appliances stood in kitchens, where their owners took pride in the progress they represented. Many families had invested small sums in the market, encouraged by advertisements that promised opportunity for all. They felt hopeful, believing that the new era of prosperity would continue indefinitely. Yet the small flicker of light on the horizon suggested that this sense of security was much more fragile than it appeared. In rural areas where night skies spread uninterrupted across fields and distant hills, the final glow blended with starlight that had guided generations long before the modern world emerged. Farmers who had struggled through months of declining crop prices slept lightly, knowing that each day brought new financial challenges. Some had mortgaged their land to purchase equipment or expand their operations during earlier periods of optimism. Others relied on credit to cover the costs of seed, fertilizer, and transportation. Radio broadcasts and newspaper reports had told them that the market was strong, that industry was thriving, and that the nation was experiencing unprecedented prosperity. Yet their daily experience contradicted these assurances. The flicker on the horizon, though barely visible in these rural regions, seemed almost symbolic, a faint warning that the difficulties they faced were part of a larger imbalance. In the mansions of the wealthy, the night was quiet and orderly. Light from chandeliers and lamps had been extinguished earlier in the evening, leaving long corridors and elaborate rooms bathed in darkness. The residents slept with the same confidence that had guided their decisions for decades. Their fortunes had weathered previous downturns. Their advisors managed complex portfolios. Their investments stretched across industries, banks, and international markets. They believed in diversification, in the permanence of their social standing, and in the strength of the American economy. Yet even within these homes, there had been recent conversations whispered in private libraries and drawing rooms, conversations about fluctuations in the market, about the increasing number of failing loans, about shipments delayed because manufacturers had scaled back production. These concerns had not yet reached the forefront of discussion, but they lingered quietly, like the faint light resisting the night. Meanwhile, the stock market continued to attract attention across the country. Families, businesses, and institutions had poured money into it, viewing it as the most direct path to prosperity. Prices had risen so rapidly and with such consistency that few questioned whether the growth reflected reality. Investors spoke excitedly about new industries and innovations, convinced that they were participating in a permanent transformation of the economy. Newspapers published daily updates, celebrating the successes of individuals who had turned small investments into significant wealth. The rising market seemed to confirm the nation's belief in progress. But beneath the surface, the number of investors borrowing money to buy stocks had grown dangerously high. A system built on confidence now required constant and unbroken trust to sustain itself. The final flicker of light against the dark sky marked the fragile tension between hope and vulnerability. It symbolized the last moment before the country would awaken to events that would test the structures of its economy, the limits of its optimism, and the endurance of its people. In the months that followed, cracks that had once been small would widen. Banks would face pressures they were unprepared to manage. Investors would confront losses greater than anything they had imagined. Families across the country, from the wealthiest to those living paycheck to paycheck, would feel the effects of a system collapsing under its own weight. But on this night, with the last faint glow still visible in the distance, the country remained unaware of the magnitude of the challenges ahead. People slept in their beds, confident that the morning would bring the usual rhythm of work, news, and daily routines. They did not yet know that the faint flicker, struggling to remain visible, was the final light of stability before the darkness would deepen, and that the dawn to come would reveal a nation transformed. As the light finally disappeared, the night settled fully across the land, marking a stillness that carried within it the first quiet moments before a storm unlike anything the country had experienced before. The night that settled fully across the land after that last faint glow disappeared seemed deeper than the nights that had come before it. It was a darkness that felt complete, stretching without interruption across cities, towns, and rural fields, as if the entire nation had entered a single, shared moment of stillness. Yet within that stillness, something unseen began to shift. It was subtle at first, a faint tension moving through the financial networks that connected businesses, banks, and households. Most Americans slept without awareness of this change, believing that the next morning would follow the familiar pattern of daily life. But in a few places, inside quiet offices, in the thoughts of worried bankers, and in the thin, restless hours of those who had sensed instability, the darkness carried a weight that suggested the beginning of something profound. It felt as though the country held its breath, waiting unknowingly for the pressure building beneath the surface to reveal itself. When morning finally arrived, it did not bring clarity. It emerged slowly, with a pale light that spread unevenly across the horizon, unable to fully dispel the heaviness of the night before. The dawn seemed muted, as though the sun struggled to break through an atmosphere unsettled by forces too large to be contained. This subdued morning light entered the financial districts first, touching the stone surfaces of buildings that housed the country's most powerful institutions. Clerks, brokers, and executives arrived early, carrying briefcases and newspapers that reported on global markets, foreign debts, and domestic production. They moved through revolving doors into lobbies filled with echoing footsteps, unaware that the balance of the system they served was nearing its breaking point. Inside these buildings, the teletypes began to print numbers that no longer behaved predictably. Stocks that had risen steadily for years started to fluctuate sharply. Reports arrived with unexpected declines. Analysts who had dismissed earlier concerns now found themselves returning to spreadsheets with growing unease. Rumors traveled quickly, from office to office, from telephone call to telephone call, suggesting that large investors were beginning to sell. Yet even as these signals appeared, many remained confident that the market would correct itself. After all, it had done so before. But this time, the corrections that traders expected never came. Instead, the fluctuations intensified, reflecting deeper fractures that had remained hidden for far too long. As the morning progressed, the pale light grew brighter, but remained strangely colorless, as though mirroring the uncertainty unfolding behind the glass windows of the financial world. Brokers began to speak in hurried tones. Banks contacted one another for updates. Some firms called clients quietly, advising caution. Others urged calm, believing that overreaction would do more harm than good. But even in these early hours, the momentum of the system had shifted. Confidence, once the foundation that supported millions of investments, now wavered like a thin thread pulled too tightly. And without confidence, the system's complexity began to collapse under its own weight. Outside, the city continued its normal rhythms. Streetcars rang their bells, vendors opened their stands, office workers filled sidewalks as they headed toward their jobs. The ordinary sounds of morning masked the instability that was growing behind closed doors. Yet the pale light, persistent and steady, seemed to move with a quiet urgency, as though urging the nation to pay attention. It revealed faces glancing uneasily at newspaper headlines. It illuminated the hurried pace of couriers delivering urgent messages. It cast long shadows across exchange floors where the day's trading would soon begin, with a tension not felt in years. In middle-class neighborhoods, the morning routines continued without interruption. Parents prepared children for school, radios carried stories of inventions, sports, and weather reports. Families ate breakfast at kitchen tables made polished by years of careful use. Many of these families had invested modest sums in the market, encouraged by advertisements that called it a gateway to modern prosperity. They believed in steady gains, in the reliability of the nation's growth, in the safety of investing alongside millions of others. As they left their homes, they did so with confidence in systems they trusted completely. The pale morning light entering their windows offered no hint of what was unfolding downtown. For the wealthy, the morning began as it often did, quietly, with newspapers delivered to doorsteps and staff preparing the day's schedule. But even here, the first signs of concern appeared. Estate managers received letters from banks requesting updated financial documents. Advisors sent early morning telegrams with cautious language. Some families discussed diversifying their investments. Others reassured one another that cycles of fluctuation were natural and temporary. Yet beneath the calm surfaces of their conversations, a faint tension pressed gently against their long-held sense of security. The pale light streaming through their tall windows revealed expressions more thoughtful than usual, gestures slightly slower, and a silence that settled between sentences. In rural communities, the dawn had brought farmers to their fields long before most of the country awoke. They loaded wagons, checked equipment, and prepared for another day's labor. But when they tuned their radios to hear the latest market reports, the tone of the broadcasts seemed less confident. Grain prices fluctuated without reason. Banks tightened their lending guidelines. Some merchants grew cautious about offering credit. The pale light across the fields, soft and unbroken, revealed concerns that had been building for years, concerns that were now becoming part of a much larger and far more troubling pattern. By late morning, the financial district was no longer calm. The pale light outside contrasted sharply with the rising panic inside, where stock prices began to fall faster than brokers could report them. Investors rushed to sell, crowding the exchange floor with orders. Telephones rang without pause. Messengers moved quickly through corridors, carrying instructions that only grew more desperate as the hour advanced. Bankers contacted one another in an attempt to stabilize the situation, but the volume of sales overwhelmed every effort. Prices dropped further, confidence collapsed, and the system that had built the fortunes of the Gilded Age, built the mansions, the industries, the railroads, the modern conveniences, now revealed its fragility in undeniable terms. Outside, the pale light reached its fullest brightness of the day, but it seemed thin, almost overspread across the sky, offering none of the warmth or stability that earlier generations had associated with American progress. It held a stillness that felt unnatural, as though the air itself had paused to witness the beginning of a monumental shift. By early afternoon, the nation entered a new era, one defined not by expansion, but by uncertainty. And as the pale light continued to stretch across the land, it illuminated the first clear outlines of a crisis that would soon reshape every aspect of American life. The pale light that had stretched thinly across the sky through the tense morning hours began to flatten and cool as it approached midday, losing what little warmth it had carried. It washed over the streets in a muted tone, neither bright nor dim, as if reflecting the strange condition of the nation itself, uncertain, off balance, and pulled suddenly into a reality few had been prepared to face. Inside the financial district, the collapse that had begun quietly now unfolded with unmistakable force. The delicate structure of credit and speculation that had once seemed capable of supporting limitless prosperity cracked open in full view, and the sound of its breaking carried outward in ways no one could contain. The pale light, steady and indifferent, bore silent witness as the foundations of an entire era shifted beneath the weight of fear. By midday, the stock exchange had become a place of frantic movement. The trading floor, often loud but orderly, erupted into chaos. Prices fell faster than clerks could record them. Orders piled up without buyers. Men who had stood confidently for years now shouted into telephones, their voices strained with disbelief. Some stared at the large boards overhead, watching numbers plummet with a speed that seemed unreal. Others pushed through the crowds, attempting to find someone, anyone, who might still be willing to purchase a few shares before they dropped further. The air felt thick, charged with panic that no amount of reasoning could quiet. The pale light streaming through the exchange windows only sharpened the sense of exposure, as if the nation's financial machinery had been placed under a harsh, unforgiving lens. Banks attempted to intervene, holding hurried meetings in high offices where heavy wooden doors shut out the noise below. Executives gathered around polished tables, their faces drawn and tense. They reviewed their ledgers, checked their lines of credit, and debated strategies with a precision shaped by decades of experience. But the pace of the collapse outmatched every effort to stabilize it. The losses were too large. The withdrawal of confidence was too sudden. The pale light entering their windows fell across documents that revealed unmistakable truths, loans that could not be repaid, investments backed by inflated valuations, and a financial system stretched far beyond its safe limits. Outside, crowds gathered near the doors of major banks. Rumors spread quickly, some true, others imagined. People who had never before visited the financial district arrived with anxious expressions, holding notebooks, envelopes, or small handbags containing their savings. They requested meetings with bankers, hoping for reassurance. Some were told to remain calm. Others received vague explanations that did little to quiet their fear. As the pale light drifted across the stone steps and tall columns of these buildings, it illuminated the growing distance between those who understood the severity of the crisis and those who were only beginning to grasp its implications. Across the city, the news traveled swiftly. Radios carried the updates in measured tones, their voices steady even as they reported unprecedented declines. Newspapers printed extra editions, their headlines large and urgent. People stopped on sidewalks to read the latest bulletins. Shopkeepers stepped outside their stores to discuss the events with customers. Families called relatives to share the information they had heard. The pale light spread evenly across these scenes, casting no judgment, simply revealing a nation entering a moment that would alter its trajectory. In middle-class homes, the news arrived with confusion and disbelief. Families who had invested modestly in the market did not know how to interpret the reports. They had trusted advertisements that described the stock market as a pathway to stability and progress. They had believed that growth would continue. Now, as they listened to the reports, they felt a subtle tightening in their chests, a realization that the security they had worked so hard to achieve might be slipping away. The pale light entering their kitchens and living rooms revealed faces filled with worry, uncertainty, and questions they could not yet answer. For the wealthy, the collapse struck with a force they had not foreseen. Rooms once filled with confidence now held quiet conversations marked by tension. Advisors were summoned. Family members gathered around large desks covered with papers and telegrams. Safes were opened, their contents examined carefully. Investments that had once seemed unshakable now appeared fragile. Decisions that had been made confidently only months before now demanded reconsideration. Some families attempted to liquidate assets. Others tried to move funds to banks they believed more secure, but no strategy seemed sufficient. The pale light that filled their grand homes revealed the same vulnerability that touched every other household, regardless of wealth. In rural communities, the worsening crisis reached families who had already been struggling. Crop prices had fallen for years. Debt weighed heavily on farmers. Now, with banks facing collapse, the loans that kept many farms operating became uncertain. Some families listened to the news with a quiet resignation, understanding instinctively that the challenges ahead would be severe. Others felt shock, unsure how events unfolding in distant financial centers could so profoundly affect their daily lives. The pale light spreading across fields and farmland created long, muted patterns on the ground, reflecting the uncertainty stretching across the country. As the afternoon progressed, the collapse grew larger, more visible and more inescapable. Businesses halted orders. Manufacturers stopped production. Investors sold whatever they could, often at a fraction of what they had paid. Banks closed their doors earlier than usual. Thousands of people found themselves suddenly unsure of their savings, their investments, and their futures. The pale light continued to stretch across the land, steady and unchanging, as though indifferent to the turmoil unfolding beneath it. By the time the sun began its slow decline toward evening, the country had entered a state of collective realization. This was not a temporary fluctuation. This was not a momentary downturn. It was the beginning of a crisis so wide-reaching that it would transform the lives of nearly every American, from the wealthiest industrialist to the families living in small apartments and rural homes. The pale light dimmed slightly as clouds gathered, casting long shadows across crowded streets and quiet fields alike. And in that subtle darkening, the nation began to understand that it was stepping into a period defined not by growth, but by hardship, a period that would test its resilience, reshape its institutions, and redefine the world that had once seemed so secure. The long shadows cast by the dimming afternoon light stretched farther across the land as the sun began its slow descent, and with each passing minute, the sense of unease deepened. What had begun as scattered moments of confusion in the financial district now became an undeniable truth, spreading through the entire nation. The collapse was no longer contained within the walls of banks or the frantic motions of a trading floor. It was seeping outward, reaching into offices, storefronts, homes, and farms. The softening light, once a symbol of comfort, now carried an unmistakable heaviness, as though the day itself understood that the world it had illuminated for so long was changing in ways that would not soon be reversed. Evening approached not gently, but with the slow, relentless certainty of a tide coming ashore. In the financial district, exhaustion began to overtake panic. Brokers who had spent hours shouting into telephones now stood in quieter clusters, staring at figures that no longer shocked them because the magnitude of the losses had surpassed every expectation. Some leaned against desks, their jackets wrinkled, their eyes unfocused. Others sat heavily on stools, reviewing notes that no longer mattered. A few continued to work mechanically, driven more by habit than by hope. The lines of pale light still shining through the windows revealed a scene unlike anything the nation had witnessed. Papers were scattered across the floor. Telephones rang unanswered. The usual structured energy of the market had dissolved into disorder. And yet, amid the disarray, a strange calm began to settle. The calm that comes when the worst has already happened and people have not yet begun to imagine the consequences. Bankers met behind closed doors, their voices low and somber. The decisions they faced were impossible. Reserves were insufficient to cover the demands of depositors. Loans had defaulted. Investments that had seemed secure only weeks earlier had evaporated. They considered measures to stabilize their institutions, but each option revealed risks that no bank could manage alone. Some spoke of requesting federal assistance, though the government's capacity to intervene remained limited by the standards of the time. Others debated temporary closures, hoping that time might soften the panic. But time, they realized, was no longer an ally. As the last rays of sunlight filtered into their offices, the gravity of their situation settled upon them like the deepening dusk. Beyond the financial centers, the news had spread through cities with a speed born of fear. Shopkeepers closed their doors early, their expressions strained. Customers who had stopped by for small purchases instead gathered in groups to discuss the latest reports. Some expressed anger, others expressed disbelief. Most simply felt uncertainty. Children sensed their parents' tension. Factory workers finishing their shifts found managers waiting with announcements of cut hours, suspended orders, or layoffs. Clerks in department stores watched customers walk past displays without buying anything, hesitant to spend even small amounts of money. The faint warmth of the afternoon had faded, replaced by a coolness that touched the emotions of everyone who walked beneath the dimming light. In middle-class homes, families gathered around radios to hear updates delivered in steady, composed voices. Announcers spoke of market instability, economic correction, and temporary setbacks, but their careful language did little to ease worry. Parents exchanged glances across dinner tables, quietly calculating how long their savings might last. Some considered delaying planned purchases. Others wondered whether their jobs were secure. The pale light entering their homes grew weaker, casting long shadows along walls and floors. Those shadows seemed to lengthen not only across the rooms, but across their expectations for the future. For the wealthy, the impact of the collapse was immediate and profound. Homes filled with the hum of whispered conversations. Telephones rang with urgency. Financial advisors arrived in evening hours, carrying briefcases filled with documents that could no longer offer the reassurances they once had. Some wealthy families realized that their fortunes had diminished dramatically in a single day. Investments carefully built over decades had lost value overnight. Land holdings, business shares, and securities that had been considered untouchable now showed vulnerabilities previously unimaginable. The soft evening light that filtered through their tall windows revealed a new reality. They, too, were subject to the forces that had humbled so many others. In rural communities, the evening arrived quietly but heavily. Farmers returned from their fields with a sense of foreboding. For them, the collapse of the market was not simply a financial event, it was the final blow in a long sequence of hardships. Crop prices had been struggling for years. Equipment loans weighed heavily. Now, with banks failing and credit disappearing, many farmers realized they might lose land their families had worked for generations. The soft light settling across fields felt colder than usual, as though the land itself sensed the uncertainty pressing against it. As twilight approached, the nation found itself united by a shared feeling it had not experienced in decades, a sense of collective vulnerability. In earlier years, crises had come and gone, but never had so many people from so many walks of life felt their stability threatened at the same time. The fading light stretched thin across rooftops and roads marked the end of a day that had shaken the confidence of an entire country. And yet, as night drew closer, the full weight of what had occurred remained unclear. People speculated, wondered, and feared, but they could not yet see the shape of the hardship that would follow. Banks would fail, businesses would close, homes would be lost. Soup lines and bread kitchens would emerge where wealth had once defined the landscape. The Gilded Age, already fading, now met its true end, not with a single event, but with a collapse that would unravel the world it had created. As the last trace of daylight slipped behind the horizon, a quiet stillness fell across the land. It was the stillness of a country standing at the threshold of the Great Depression, unaware of the full force of the years ahead, but feeling, within the deepening dusk, the unmistakable beginning of a long, difficult descent. The last traces of daylight dissolved into the darkness, leaving behind a silence that felt unusually deep for a nation so accustomed to constant motion. That silence, which had settled gently across streets, fields, and the interiors of homes, lingered into the early hours of the night and carried itself into the next morning. It was in that silence that the nation first heard the subtle shift that would define the days to come. A quiet tightening of worry, becoming something heavier, something more permanent. Dawn broke pale and thin, as though the sun itself hesitated to illuminate what lay ahead. And with that hesitant dawn came the early signs of a transformation that would ripple through every layer of American life. In the cities, the first light revealed long lines forming outside the doors of banks. People arrived early, hoping to withdraw their savings before it was too late. They stood in coats pulled tight against the morning chill, sharing bits of information that none could verify. Some brought children because they had no one to watch them. Others carried small bags or envelopes, unsure whether the money they withdrew would need to last for days or months. The soft morning light fell across their faces, revealing a mixture of worry and determination. Bank tellers, themselves uncertain of what would happen next, opened their doors with forced composure. They worked quickly but calmly, handing out cash while glancing at back-office supervisors who communicated in muted gestures. Behind those gestures was the knowledge that many banks did not have enough on hand to meet the rush. Between customers, some tellers closed their eyes briefly, trying to steady themselves for the hours ahead. And as the lines grew, the murmur of fear deepened. The light that had appeared so tender at dawn now cast a sharper clarity on just how fragile trust had become. Shops opened slowly. Owners swept their sidewalks as they always had, but their movement seemed slower, their eyes drifting toward the bank lines, the newspapers, and the thin crowds passing by. They arranged displays, but customers were hesitant to buy, carefully weighing each purchase. A few stores remained dark, their owners deciding that opening would cost more than it would earn. Layouts of storefronts looked unchanged, yet the routines that had given life to each day now felt burdened by uncertainty. Even the early delivery wagons, which usually moved briskly through the streets, slowed their pace as drivers absorbed the familiar landscape in its new silence. The city felt suspended, as though everyone awaited instructions that never came. As the day unfolded, factories sounded their whistles, but fewer workers entered than usual. Some shifts had been canceled without notice. Others found their hours reduced. Supervisors gathered workers to explain that production orders had stalled or vanished entirely. The words which echoed through metal corridors and dusty workshops carried no blame, only frustration. Workers listened with folded arms and lowered gazes, understanding the truth without needing to hear every detail. They had survived layoffs before, but never with the sinking understanding that entire industries might falter. Machines that had filled the air with steady rhythmic noise now fell silent for long stretches, their stillness amplifying the unease. Outside the factory gates, small groups stood talking in low voices, exchanging rumors of what might come next. Families gathered again around radios throughout the country. Announcers offered level descriptions of market corrections, cautioning listeners not to panic. Yet even the calmest broadcasts could not mask the underlying reality. People sat in living rooms wrapped in quilts, clutching coffee cups or clasping their hands together. Some leaned closer, as though a clearer signal might reveal more hopeful news. Parents glanced toward their children, who sensed the change but could not fully comprehend it. Household conversations, once filled with small daily concerns, now revolved around bills, wages, and savings. The light through windows brightened and dimmed as clouds drifted past, creating a soft rhythm that felt almost comforting compared to the hard facts emerging from the radio speaker. In the offices of the wealthy, daylight illuminated stacks of financial statements that had once symbolized security. Now those same numbers revealed gaps, losses, and vulnerabilities. Advisors worked through the morning, calculating, revising, and recalculating again. Wealth that had seemed enduring now required management, protection, and in many cases, acceptance of its sudden fragility. Some families closed heavy drapes to conduct difficult discussions in privacy. Others walked through rooms filled with objects acquired during prosperous years, touched by the strange realization that possessions offered no comfort in times of economic fear. The polished floors, high ceilings, and ornate furnishings no longer felt reassuring. Instead, they felt burdensome, reminders of commitments and expenses that might soon become impossible to afford. Farmers, too, began their morning routines with a sharpened awareness of the shifting world. They fed livestock and checked equipment, but their minds were not on the day's tasks. They were on the price of grain, the value of livestock, and the mounting debts owed to banks now teetering on collapse. The cycle of planting and harvesting had always been demanding, but it had never felt as uncertain as it did now. The early sunlight stretched across wide fields, highlighting wagons, fences, and barns, with a gentleness that contrasted starkly with the weight pressing on every decision. Even the quiet countryside could not escape the reach of fear that had settled over the nation. By midday, the country had entered a phase of collective pause. People worked, walked, and moved as they always had, but beneath the surface was a shared apprehension. Markets continued to decline. Banks struggled to meet demands. Factories reduced output. Newspapers printed cautious headlines. Yet the full force of the collapse had not yet arrived. What people felt instead was a sense of suspended motion, the uneasy stillness before understanding fully takes shape. Conversations across the nation carried the same tone, whether spoken in crowded cities or quiet towns, a mixture of disbelief, worry, and the hope that conditions might stabilize quickly. But as the light began to shift again, softening into the muted gold of late afternoon, it became clear that the crisis was expanding beyond what anyone had imagined. Each passing hour revealed new complications. Businesses that had survived previous downturns now faced dangers they could not navigate. Banks that had seemed secure now confronted shortages they could not overcome. The nation, still adjusting to the events of the previous evening, stood at the threshold of something vast and unforgiving, a crisis that would not fade with time or resolve itself quietly. And as shadows lengthened once more, the same question lingered across the land. How far would the collapse reach, and what would remain of the world the Gilded Age had built? The question of how far the collapse would reach hung heavily in the quiet that followed, drifting like a thin veil across streets, buildings, and landscapes. The late afternoon light, already softened by the passing hours, dimmed slowly as the sun descended, slipping behind rooftops and hills as though reluctant to witness what was coming next. Evening settled once again, but it was not the peaceful kind that had accompanied earlier days. This was an evening shaped by unease, where every faint sound, a distant train whistle, a door closing, a radio turning on, seemed sharper and more significant. And as the last of the daylight faded, the country braced itself, not with conscious intention, but with the quiet instinct that something deeper was beginning to unfold beneath the surface. By nightfall, lines at banks had dispersed, but only because doors had closed for the evening. Many people walked home in silence, carrying envelopes of money or leaving empty-handed with the hope that tomorrow might bring reassurance. Street lamps flickered on as the sky darkened, casting small islands of yellow light that illuminated faces etched with worry. In some neighborhoods, groups formed on sidewalks, discussing the day's events in hushed, urgent tones. No one had clear answers. The air held a strange stillness, as though the entire city were listening for news that had not yet arrived. Inside homes, families gathered around radios once more. The warm glow of the radio dial offered a small comfort, but the announcements that drifted through the speakers carried a weight heavier than the night before. Reports spoke of additional market losses, of banks closing temporarily, of businesses scaling back operations. Words such as instability and contraction appeared more often. Listeners leaned closer, holding on to every sentence, hoping for a hint of optimism. But even the calmest voices could not disguise the uncertainty now pressing against the nation. When families turned the radios off, a deep silence filled their living rooms, the kind that magnifies every thought and makes sleep difficult. In the financial district, some lights remained on well into the night. Inside tall buildings, executives and board members held emergency meetings, seated around long wooden tables under the glow of shaded lamps. Papers were spread across tables, showing figures that no longer made sense. Bank presidents spoke in low voices, their words precise but heavy with concern. They examined reserves, studied loan defaults, debated strategies, and attempted to predict outcomes that had grown increasingly unpredictable. Some paced the floors, hands clasped behind their backs. Others sat motionless, absorbing the reality that decades of expansion had been built upon foundations far weaker than they had ever admitted. The darkness outside their windows felt absolute, a vast reminder of how small their control had become. Warehouse districts and factory yards, usually quiet at night, now held a different kind of silence. Machinery that had operated without pause for years stood in the dark, still and cold. Workers who had completed evening shifts walked home slowly, their lunch pails swinging lightly at their sides. Some passed bulletin boards listing new schedule reductions. Others avoided looking at the notices altogether. The soft glow from nearby streetlights cast long shadows across factory walls, emphasizing the stillness. It was a stillness felt not only in the buildings, but in the workers themselves, who sensed a growing unease they could not yet define. In wealthier districts, dinner tables were quiet. Families accustomed to hosting lively gatherings now spoke softly, choosing their words carefully. Courses were served and cleared in silence. Servants moved quietly through hallways, aware of the tension but uncertain how to help. After dinner, family members retreated to private studies or drawing rooms, where they read telegrams or reports delivered earlier in the day. The sounds of clocks ticking in the background felt louder than usual. The elegance of their surroundings, Fine woodwork, portraits, crystal lamps offered little comfort. Wealth could soften many hardships, but even the wealthy felt the gravity of a crisis unfolding on a scale that exceeded the boundaries of class. In the countryside, nightfall brought a quiet just as heavy. Farmers finished tending to livestock and stepped outside to lock barn doors, looking across fields that spread out beneath the pale glow of the moon. These fields had sustained families for generations, offering both struggle and stability. But now, with banks failing and market prices falling, the land itself felt uncertain. Farmers spoke with their families in quiet, steady voices, discussing the possibility of postponed purchases or delayed repairs. Some stared out into the darkness, hearing distant barn owls or the rustle of wind through dry grass. The night sky, usually a source of calm, now felt vast and indifferent. As the hours passed, the entire country seemed to exist in a shared moment of stillness. It was a pause between what had been lost and what had not yet fully revealed itself. People lay awake in their beds, listening to the faint sounds of cars passing outside or the shifting creaks of old houses. Thoughts circled in quiet loops. Savings, wages, debts, mortgages, food costs, job security. The future, once imagined with clarity, now felt blurred. And yet this heavy silence did not last long. The next morning, as dawn slowly replaced darkness, the first signs of a new phase of the crisis began to appear. This phase would not be defined by the immediate panic of stock market collapse or bank lines, but by something more enduring and far-reaching: the gradual unraveling of businesses, households, and institutions that depended on one another in ways the country had never fully realized. The pale morning light, returning once again with hesitation, fell across a nation poised at the beginning of what would soon be known as the Great Depression. And beneath that light, the first threads of everyday life began to loosen, one by one, revealing the deeper fractures that the collapse had set into motion. The pale morning light that returned after that tense night felt thinner than before, as though stretched across a landscape that no longer held the same shape it once had. It touched rooftops, windows, factory chimneys, and farmland with a softness that carried no warmth, only a muted clarity. Across the nation, people rose from restless sleep and stepped into a day shaped not by sudden shock, but by the slow, steady unraveling that follows a seismic shift. It was in the small details that the change first became visible: a shop door that remained closed past its usual hour, a factory whistle that did not sound, a bank window covered by a hastily written notice. These signs, subtle yet unmistakable, marked the beginning of a deeper phase of the crisis, one that would reach far beyond the abrupt collapse of markets and settle into the routines, expectations, and hopes of everyday life. In the cities, as the early light spread across sidewalks and buildings, office workers arrived to find new notices taped to their doors. Some companies announced temporary closures, others reduced hours. A few posted longer statements asking employees for patience as leadership navigated unexpected financial strain. People stood reading these messages in silence, their breath forming small clouds in the cool morning air. Some turned away slowly, unsure whether to return home or search for temporary work. Others remained standing, as though hoping that someone might emerge from behind the locked doors to offer clarification. The pale light revealed the uncertainty in their eyes. Uncertainty not only about the day before them, but about the weeks and months that would follow. Inside the businesses that did open, the atmosphere felt changed. Offices that once buzzed with steady motion now felt sparse. Fewer typewriters clicked. Fewer phones rang. Clerks moved quietly from desk to desk. Managers spoke in measured tones, trying to maintain a sense of order while privately confronting the possibility that their companies might not survive the downturn. The morning sunlight, reflecting off polished surfaces, cast long, narrow patterns across the floors, patterns that seemed to emphasize the emptiness of the spaces that had once been full. Shops faced a similar change. Owners opened their doors reluctantly, aware that customers were now hesitant to spend money on anything beyond the essentials. Merchandise that had taken months to acquire remained untouched on shelves. Tailors, shoemakers, and craftsmen found their work increasingly infrequent. Restaurant tables remained empty through breakfast hours, with only a few customers entering to order the smallest meals available. The slow trickle of people passing storefront windows reflected the growing caution of a population unsure of its financial footing. The morning light glimmered faintly across display cases that had once represented prosperity and now stood as reminders of how quickly purchasing power could dissolve. As the morning progressed, factories revealed their own signs of strain. Some gates remained locked, with handwritten notes announcing temporary shutdowns due to lack of orders. Workers gathered outside in small groups, speaking quietly, their worn jackets pulled tight against the chill. Many had sensed these closures coming, but seeing the reality written on paper brought a heaviness no rumor could match. Those factories that continued to operate did so at reduced capacity. Machines that had once roared from morning until night now sat idle for hours at a time. Supervisors walked the floor slowly, checking equipment that had not been used in days. The thin morning light filtering through dusty windows emphasized the stillness of spaces built for noise. Banks, burdened by days of strain, opened cautiously. Guards stood near doors. Tellers spoke softly, their expressions composed but tense. Managers monitored the flow of customers carefully, aware that even a single rush could exhaust their diminished reserves. Notices were posted explaining temporary withdrawal limits, prompting frustration but little surprise. People lined up quietly, holding withdrawal slips, utility bills, or small ledgers. The pale light through the bank windows cast a cool glow over their faces, revealing the fatigue of those who had waited for hours in lines the previous day. The trust that had once been the invisible support of the banking system had weakened, and the morning light now revealed how vulnerable that system had become. In middle-class neighborhoods, the new day felt unsettlingly quiet. Families ate breakfast in silence, each person absorbed in thoughts they did not voice aloud. Parents reviewed budgets at kitchen tables, running calculations again and again, trying to determine how long their savings would last. Some set aside envelopes labeled rent or groceries. Others wrote down lists of expenses to eliminate: magazines, outings, meat on certain days. Children prepared for school, noticing the worry in their parents' faces, but not fully understanding its cause. The pale morning light that entered through the windows gave the rooms a clarity that made every detail noticeable. The thinning pile of coal beside the heater, the worn edges of a coat, the sound of a teaspoon quietly stirring coffee. For wealthier families, the changes appeared in different forms but carried the same weight. Morning newspapers placed neatly on dining tables displayed headlines that grew more alarming with each passing day. Breakfast conversations revolved around stock holdings, business risks, and strategies for protecting what remained of family fortunes. Some households dismissed servants or reduced their staff, offering polite explanations but unable to hide the discomfort such decisions caused. The soft morning light reflecting off fine tableware and polished floors created a contrast that felt sharper than ever. The contrast between the outward symbols of abundance and the inward recognition that wealth, too, could shrink quickly when the foundations beneath it gave way. In rural communities, the shift toward deeper hardship became unmistakable. Farmers rose early, as they always had, but the fields they stepped into now represented something different. The soil, which had sustained them through lean years and prosperous seasons alike, now stood as a silent witness to economic forces far beyond the boundaries of their land. Prices for crops continued to fall. Banks grew reluctant to extend credit. Repairing equipment became a decision weighed with caution. The pale morning light stretched across wide fields, illuminating frost on fences, the worn edges of barns, and the quiet determination of farmers who faced another day of uncertainty. Their work continued, steady and unbroken, But beneath that steadiness lay the recognition that the safety nets they once relied upon, loans, savings, market stability, had weakened. By midday, the unraveling had become more visible. Newspaper articles described business failures, bank closures, and declining production. People discussed each headline with a mixture of resignation and concern. The shock of the initial collapse had passed, but its consequences now unfolded slowly, touching every corner of daily life. The pale light, which had marked so many quiet realizations in the morning hours, continued to stretch across the land, illuminating the early stages of a transformation that would take years to fully unfold. And as the day progressed, one question began to echo more frequently, whispered in homes, businesses, and fields alike. How would the country endure the hardships that were only beginning to emerge? The question of how the country would endure these hardships lingered in the air long after it was first spoken, slipping quietly into conversations, settling into the pauses between sentences, and echoing silently through homes, factories, banks, and barns. It followed people as they moved through their day. It threaded itself into their thoughts as naturally as breath. And as the pale afternoon light began its slow drift toward evening, that light seemed to acknowledge the weight of the question by softening around the edges of everything it touched. Yet beneath its gentleness, a deeper shadow formed, a shadow shaped not by sudden panic, but by the steady accumulation of small, undeniable losses. In the cities, people felt the shift most visibly in their workplaces. Shops that had struggled through the morning closed earlier than usual, their owners unable to justify staying open with so few customers. They flipped signs to closed, swept their floors with tired motions, and stood for a long moment at the threshold before locking the door, wondering quietly whether they would reopen the next day. Some carried ledgers home with them. Others left them behind, unable to bear tallying the losses again. The afternoon light faded slowly across their storefront windows, catching the dust that floated in the air and casting long shadows across the displays that had once promised possibility. Office buildings emptied earlier than normal, too. Clerks left with a heaviness in their steps, uncertain whether they would be returning the following morning. Managers who stayed behind worked late into the afternoon, assembling reports for company heads who searched vainly for signs of stability. As employees walked down staircases and out through tall revolving doors, the pale light reflected off polished brass railings and glass panes, creating fleeting shapes that mirrored the fleeting certainty of their once secure lives. The sidewalks outside filled not with the brisk motion of a typical afternoon, but with slow-moving clusters of people whose conversations circled endlessly around the same worries: rent, wages, savings, and the unsettling sense that the ground beneath them was shifting. Factories that had worked at reduced capacity through the morning now moved closer to shutting down entirely. Supervisors gathered workers on production floors to deliver updates that many had feared but hoped to avoid. Some factories announced temporary layoffs. Others halted production indefinitely. The sound of heavy machinery winding down, metal cooling, and tools being placed back onto shadowed shelves created an atmosphere unlike anything the workers had experienced before. The usual hum that vibrated through the air, through their hands, and through their routines was gone. In its absence, a deep echoing stillness settled across the vast factory spaces. When workers stepped outside, the fading afternoon light met them with a muted chill, seeming to acknowledge their worry without offering comfort. Banks continued to struggle with long lines throughout the day. Many had imposed strict withdrawal limits to prevent their reserves from disappearing altogether. Customers waiting in line watched as staff whispered hurriedly with managers or examined ledgers with furrowed brows. Notices appeared more frequently: new policies, temporary closures, and instructions for customers seeking assistance. The pale light slanted through the bank windows in narrowing beams, casting thin rectangles across the floors. Those beams served as silent reminders of the dwindling options available to both banks and depositors. As the sunlight dimmed, those inside felt an increasing urgency to complete their transactions before nightfall locked all options away once again. In middle-class homes, the afternoon brought difficult adjustments. Parents began drafting new budgets, crossing out items they once considered essential. Weekly outings were postponed. Plans were rethought. Children returned from school carrying stories of classmates whose parents had lost jobs or whose families faced moves to smaller homes. These stories spread quietly from household to household, drifting into evening conversations. Families sat together in living rooms, the dimming light stretching shadows across walls as they talked about the future in gentle tones meant to protect one another from fear. But beneath the soft voices lay an unspoken understanding that life had begun to tighten in ways that could not be undone quickly. For wealthy families, the afternoon held its own form of reckoning. Financial advisors arrived with updates that grew more troubling by the day. Losses deepened. Investments that had seemed secure now unraveled under scrutiny. Some households convened formal meetings in their drawing rooms or libraries, reviewing portfolios while the fading light filtered through heavy drapes. Estate managers presented options, all of which required sacrifices, selling property, closing accounts, reducing staff. Discussions that once would have involved expansion or acquisition now focused solely on preservation. The wealth that had long insulated these families from hardship no longer offered guaranteed protection, and as the sunlight dimmed across their high ceilings and marble floors, even they felt the quiet touch of vulnerability. In rural communities, the transition into late afternoon brought new concerns. Farmers returned from their fields with a sense of gravity that matched the lengthening shadows across the land. They reviewed the condition of their crops, checked their livestock, and walked the boundaries of their property with slow, thoughtful steps. The steady decline of crop prices and the tightening of bank credit forced them to consider difficult choices, postponing equipment repairs, reducing seed purchases, or delaying necessary improvements. The afternoon light cast a pale glow across their fields, revealing the same soil and fences they had known for years, yet everything felt altered. The land itself seemed to absorb their worries, holding them as quietly as it had once held their hopes. By early evening, as the last of the light withdrew from the sky, the nation reached a point where the crisis was no longer a distant event unfolding through news reports. It had settled into daily life, reshaping routines, altering expectations, and rewriting plans. People returned home with heavier steps. Some prepared simpler meals. Others wrote letters to relatives, sharing concerns or seeking advice. Radios clicked on across the country, their warm glow filling rooms with the hope of clarity. But even the updates delivered in calm, steady voices could not soften the truth that hardships were deepening. The night that followed would bring more restlessness, more whispered conversations, and more silent wondering about how long the decline would last. Yet as darkness spread, one detail remained unchanged. The crisis was not nearing its end. It was settling in, creating a landscape of uncertainty that would require endurance from every family, every worker, every community. And as the last of the daylight faded completely, the nation stepped further into this new reality, unaware that the changes ahead would stretch far deeper than economic hardship alone. They would reshape American values, politics, and the meaning of opportunity itself. The deepening darkness that settled after sunset carried with it a quiet weight, as though the night itself understood that the country had crossed a threshold from which it could not return. The streets grew still, windows dimmed one by one, and the voices that rose through neighborhoods became softer, more deliberate, shaped by the questions that had taken hold of every household. Yet within that darkness, something else emerged, an unmistakable shift in the rhythm of daily life. The crisis was no longer simply an economic event, unfolding in buildings few citizens ever entered. It had become a slow, steady force, altering the shape of communities, opportunities, and expectations across the nation. By the time dawn returned, pale and subdued as always, that shift revealed itself in small details that carried large implications. In the early hours of the morning, as the first thin line of light brushed the horizon, the impact of the unraveling became visible in neighborhoods both humble and grand. A delivery cart that once made daily rounds did not appear. A milk crate remained untouched outside a doorstep, its owner having canceled the service the previous day. Newspapers folded neatly on front steps carried headlines that grew heavier with each edition. New factory closures, rising unemployment, and banks seeking emergency measures to survive another week. People collected these papers with deliberate care, as though the weight of the news required slower movements. The soft morning light, fragile in its warmth, revealed their cautious expressions as they scanned for any sign of improvement. In downtown districts, the change was even more apparent. Storefronts that had struggled through the previous weeks now displayed empty windows. Owners removed merchandise to reduce losses or to prepare for temporary closure. Streets that once bustled with shoppers moving in and out of businesses now felt oddly spacious, their surfaces reflecting the pale glow of morning with an unsettling stillness. Some merchants stood outside their doors, scanning the quiet street with the look of people trying to determine what future remained for them. A few swept their sidewalks out of habit, though the motions lacked the usual purpose. The morning light did little to brighten the faded signs above their doors or the empty aisles visible through their windows. Factories across the nation faced similar uncertainty. As the day began, many remained dark. Workers approached cautiously, unsure whether they would find the gates open or locked. Those who arrived first checked the bulletin boards near entrances, hoping to see announcements of restored shifts or at least temporary schedules. Instead, the notices often contained news of extended shutdowns or further reductions. For those fortunate enough to keep their jobs, the relief was tempered by worry. The soft light filtering through industrial windows illuminated rows of idle machines, each representing a risk of future cuts. Supervisors walked the factory floors with tense expressions, aware of the responsibilities they carried and the limited control they possessed. The morning light, stretching across steel beams and silent equipment, underscored the magnitude of the transformation unfolding. Banks that had survived the first cascade of withdrawals attempted to operate as steadily as possible. Tellers greeted customers with forced smiles, their eyes reflecting fatigue from the relentless pressure of the previous days. Managers reviewed documents with precision, issuing cautious instructions to staff. Signs limiting withdrawals remained posted near counters, written in careful language that attempted to soften the reality behind them. Yet as the pale light entered through tall windows, it cast a clarity that made pretense difficult. Customers waiting in line stood quietly, understanding that even a small transaction now carried larger implications. Some carried household ledgers tucked under their arms. Others held envelopes of bills that represented the last of their secure funds. The morning light, though gentle, revealed the strain etched into every face. In working-class homes, the effects of the crisis became harder to ignore. Families adjusted routines to conserve resources. Breakfasts became simpler, with smaller portions and careful use of supplies. Parents discussed the possibility of taking in boarders or seeking additional work, though opportunities were increasingly scarce. Children prepared for school with a sense of unease, aware that classmates had already been forced to move away in search of cheaper housing or new jobs for their families. The morning light entering through curtains illuminated rooms that now felt more fragile, their stability tied to forces far beyond the front door. For the wealthy, the morning brought a different kind of strain. Their homes remained impressive, their interiors still adorned with fine furnishings, but the conversations held within them were shaped by growing worry. Financial advisors who had once provided confident guidance now arrived with charts and reports that offered no comforting conclusions. Decisions grew more complex, whether to sell property at depressed prices, whether to dissolve partnerships, whether to release staff members who had served families for years. Some households attempted to maintain normalcy, insisting on routines that had defined their lives of comfort. But the morning light, glancing softly across polished floors and tall windows, revealed the truth. Even those with great wealth were not shielded from the shifting foundations of the entire economic order. In rural communities, the dawn brought another day of hard labor, but also a deepening sense of apprehension. Farmers hitched their horses or started their tractors, walked the length of their fields, and checked their livestock, all with the same diligence they had shown for generations. Yet the declining prices for crops and livestock made every task feel heavier. Many had taken out loans based on earlier expectations of stable markets. Now those debts loomed large. The thin morning light painted the landscape in muted tones, reflecting the quiet tension that had seeped into every corner of rural life. Families ate breakfast together, aware that the coming seasons would require sacrifices few had imagined. By midday, the country felt caught between the remnants of its familiar routines and the undeniable pull of a new and difficult reality. People moved through their tasks with a sense of determination, yet the pace of life had slowed. Small gestures took on greater meaning: a neighbor offering help, a family cutting back without complaint, a worker sharing news of a rare job opening. The pale light overhead offered no answers, but it illuminated the resilience emerging quietly across the nation. And as the day progressed, a subtle but unmistakable question began to rise. Not only how long the hardship would last, but what kind of country would emerge from it. What values would endure, what structures would fail, and what dreams would need to be rebuilt from the ground up. The hardship was no longer a temporary storm. It had become a landscape through which the entire nation now journeyed, step by careful step. The landscape of hardship through which the nation now traveled did not reveal its full shape at once. It emerged gradually, like a vast terrain slowly becoming visible through lifting fog. What people saw first were the details nearest to them: a neighbor out of work, a shop closed, a family forced to move in with relatives. But as the days stretched onward, and as the pale light of each new morning grew increasingly thin, the broader outline of the era began to take form. It was an outline defined not only by economic struggle, but by the unraveling of an entire way of life, one built during the Gilded Age and the years that followed, when faith in progress, expansion, and endless opportunity had seemed unshakable. Now those assumptions dissolved quietly, replaced by a deeper and more sobering understanding of the limits that prosperity had concealed. It became clear in the public squares and city centers first. As morning light reached the stone facades of government buildings and town halls, it revealed notices pinned to bulletin boards, announcements of relief programs, public works proposals, and emergency meetings. These notices were printed with careful wording, but beneath the formality lay the urgency of officials struggling to address problems larger than their offices had ever faced. Workers gathered beneath the boards, reading the statements slowly, searching for any measure that might offer temporary stability. Some signed their names for assistance. Others simply studied the notices before turning away, unsure whether the programs would materialize or how long they would last. The pale light cast long shadows across the steps, as though emphasizing the weight of decisions that had yet to be made. In neighborhoods throughout the cities, new patterns emerged. Families began sharing resources in ways they had not before. A pot of soup stretched across multiple households. Clothing was patched rather than replaced. Gardens, once kept for pleasure, now served as essential sources of food. People who once passed each other with polite nods now exchanged conversations about job openings, community events, and the quiet ways neighbors could help one another endure. As the afternoon sunlight drifted across these neighborhoods, it revealed the beginnings of a quiet interdependence. Hardship had stripped away the illusion that each family stood alone, replacing it with the understanding that survival required shared resilience. The economic changes also reshaped the very structure of American cities. Buildings that had once housed thriving businesses now stood empty. Some were boarded up, their interiors dark and silent. Others displayed hand-painted signs advertising auctions of remaining inventory. The wide windows that had once reflected the bright promise of the Gilded Age, its glittering ambitions and endless expansion, now reflected quieter scenes. Sidewalks sparsely populated, streets less traveled, and a kind of stillness that spoke to the magnitude of collective loss. When the afternoon light glinted off these empty windows, it created a faint shimmer that reminded some of better days, even as it underscored how far the country had shifted from its earlier prosperity. Factories and warehouses, once symbols of industrial might, revealed a similar transformation. Production lines that had hummed tirelessly now sat dormant. Conveyor belts hung motionless. The scent of oil and iron lingered in the quiet air, reminders of the pace that had once pushed American industry to the forefront of global growth. Workers who returned periodically to check for updates found themselves standing in vast, echoing spaces where every footstep seemed amplified. The afternoon light filtering through high windows fell unevenly across the machinery, illuminating dust that had settled across parts of the plant that had never been allowed to rest before. These spaces, once alive with motion and purpose, now represented the fragility of an economy that had grown too fast, too confidently, and too far out of balance. In wealthier districts, the shifts were less immediately visible, but they carried their own kind of gravity. Families accustomed to large social circles found their gatherings reduced. Invitations became less frequent. Formal dinners, once held weekly, became rare. Some households sold parcels of land or second homes. Others closed off rooms to reduce heating costs. Staff were dismissed, often with sorrow and embarrassment, as long-standing families confronted the reality that their resources were thinning. The afternoon light that filtered through ornate windows cast patterns across empty hallways and dimly lit parlors, drawing attention to the quiet changes taking place behind the polished exterior. Rural communities, too, felt the full depth of the crisis as it spread from city to countryside. Farms that had sustained families for generations now faced foreclosure. Auctions became weekly events. Neighbors gathered to watch as equipment, livestock, and even household goods were sold to cover debts. These auctions carried an emotional weight that extended far beyond financial necessity. Each item represented years of effort, seasons of labor, and memories tied to land that families believed they would always pass down. The pale afternoon sunlight sweeping across the fields made these scenes particularly stark, highlighting the contrast between the enduring natural landscape and the fragile economic structures that had supported rural life. And yet, as severe as the changes were, there remained a quiet resilience that could not be easily extinguished. Communities organized food exchanges. Churches opened their doors for relief efforts. Unemployed workers formed associations to help one another search for jobs. Families wrote letters to distant relatives, sharing advice and offering emotional support. The threads of solidarity, though delicate, began to form a network that stretched across the nation. The late afternoon light, softening as it touched rooftops and treetops, hinted at the persistence of a spirit that existed beneath the struggle, a spirit shaped by endurance rather than despair. As evening approached once more, casting its slow descent across towns and cities, the question that had accompanied the country for weeks grew deeper. What would become of the grand world the Gilded Age had built? Would its mansions, its institutions, its values survive this era of contraction? Or would the country emerge with entirely different expectations, leaner, wiser, and more aware of the delicate balance between ambition and vulnerability? The answers had not yet formed. They lay somewhere in the unfolding years ahead, beneath the shifting weight of economic hardship and the steady resolve of millions striving to endure. And as darkness returned to the land, settling with the same inevitable calm it brought every night, the nation prepared to continue its journey through the most challenging chapter it had faced in generations.